And good morning to everyone joining us. Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. My name is Sakina Sheikh and I'm the chair of this Planning and Regeneration Committee. This meeting is being live captioned by palantypists at My Clear Text. So where possible, we ask speakers not to talk over each other or committee members not to talk over each other or to speak too quickly, which is a personal challenge for myself, so I will be working on that throughout the meeting. And that any use of jargon can be kept to a minimum, and any use of acronyms are explained in order for the meeting to be captioned with as few errors as possible. Fantastic to have a full panel in front of us. We're really excited and grateful for your time and expertise, and really looking forward to getting into the crux of questions to hear from you about how we can ensure London remains as accessible as possible. Members of the public may like to follow us online at the London Assembly, and that's at London Assembly in terms of our handle on Twitter, or you can follow us using the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Now, I think we'll be expecting at some point the Portway Primary School to come and observe from Newham. But in the meantime, I wanted to say welcome back to the students of the University of College who are studying urban planning, design and management. It's great to have you here. I know some of you came to observe our meeting in October on the 15-minute city, so it's great to have you back again. Please may I remind everyone to switch their phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones when speaking. And as mentioned, today we are holding an investigation on accessibility and planning. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence.
Thank you, Jack. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on 18th of October 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed. Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? Thank you. And now, yes, we move on to our main item of business, a discussion on planning and accessibility in London. Now, the meeting, as I mentioned, will be split into 2 panels. We'll be later joined by the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipes, with officers to discuss and reflect on what we've heard from our experts today this morning in terms of how we ensure we can continue to integrate accessibility into the way that we design our city, and reflect on how it's experienced in its current sort of infrastructure. I'm going to welcome our guests. We'll start with Dr. Teri Okoro, founder and director of TOCA Architects, Jane Wilmot, OBE, chair of Hammersmith and Fulham Inclusive Design Review Panel, Hallie Banish, campaigns and communications manager at Ruils. Ruils, I'm probably mispronouncing that, aren't I? Ruils, there we go, Ruils. Laura Vicinanza, apologies if I butchered your surname, please do correct me when we give you an opportunity to come in. Policy Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Inclusion London, Fairmaner, Head of Business Development, Centre for Accessible Environments, and Harriet Bell, someone who's asked herself to be described as having an ability impairment who can speak to the barriers they've encountered, and a real pleasure to have met you recently at the LSE Roundtable on the future of the London Plan. Wow, what a fantastic lineup we have. Thank you again all for being here. For the purposes of live captioning, can guests and Assembly members introduce themselves when speaking for the first time? Before we get into the questions, I also just wanted to say something that, again, excuse the clumsiness of my language, but I've had the pleasure of always working with campaigners working on these issues, disabled Londoners and beyond, and they've always said that there is a spectrum of language that's maybe seen as appropriate or suitable, and I think that unfortunately this conversation doesn't happen as often as it should, which means I don't think there is a fluency in people's language around this. So if at any point, personally, I'll say this just on behalf of myself as chair, there's a need to correct the language that we use, please do feel free to do so. I don't want to necessarily speak on behalf of committee members in regards to that. But one thing, for instance, I've been told is rather than to describe people as having disabilities, you say disabled people. and then people with impairments, rather than saying people with disabilities, because we attempt to use the social model of disability, which speaks to the idea that people don't have disabilities, but rather it's the design of society that disables people. So please come in at any point with language that needs correcting. Okay, I'm going to get us started on our first question. And I'll be kicking us off with, what are the most significant challenges that those with impairments currently face in navigating the built environment in London? I imagine everyone can speak to this, so I'd be very happy to start with whoever wants to indicate, or we can start one way and go down that way. Who would like to start us off? Farah, you look like you're indicating. You just want to go? Oh, Laura, please kick us off. Perfect. Well, we'll start with Laura, and then if others are able to indicate as and when they're ready to come in, that would be grand.
Great. Thank you for the question. So unfortunately, disabled people face a number of accessibility barriers when navigating the built environment, and this prevents us from enjoying the same opportunities as non-disabled people. And this is despite the recognition that all deaf and disabled people have the same right as non-disabled people. So one of the key accessibility barriers, and let me clarify that when we talk about accessibility, we do not just talk about physical accessibility, we also talk about accessibility in terms of meeting the needs of deaf people, people who are neurodivergent, people who have any medical condition for which they identify as disabled, people who have experienced mental distress or mental trauma. So this is really important for me to say. So one of the key accessibility barriers from our perspective is the inaccessibility of the street space. We know, unfortunately, there are still obstacles on pavements, clutter, dockless bikes, e-scooters, and also the design and state of roads is often a big challenge for people with visual and mobility impairments. There are often not dropped curbs in some areas, which means that entire sections of the pavements are no-go zones for wheelchair users. Often there are no alcoves or benches. That means that people are unable to stop and rest. There are disabled people who can cycle, by the way, and the cycle infrastructure is often inaccessible with narrow lanes that cannot be used by tree cycles, hand cycles, and other non-standard cycles, and also lack of storage facilities for non-standard cycles. These, of course, are just some of the accessibility barriers. I could talk for ages. But when we look at public transport, of course, there are a series of accessibility barriers. We know, unfortunately, that just 92 out of 270 tube stations are fully accessible in the sense that they offer step-free access. Buses, even though they are the most affordable and accessible form of transport, are still present a series of challenges for disabled people. One of the key issues is that the bus infrastructure is often poor. There are no seatings for people, and this is a key problem, for example, for people with chronic fatigue who might need to rest while they're waiting for the bus to come. And also, we have received so many concerns by people with visual mobility impairments around bus stop bypasses, because their design is a problem for many people, because they're expected to step onto a cycle lane in order to get off the bus and get on the bus. And then our focus has been on housing and how inaccessible the state of housing is, not just in London, but across England. And all disabled people have really the right to live in inaccessible homes that meet their needs. Unfortunately, we know that this is not often the case, and living in inaccessible homes is really a postcode lottery. I just wanted to say that in London, the situation is slightly better compared to the rest of England, in the sense that we've got higher accessibility standards, we've got accessible housing targets in place, but disabled people still find it really hard to find accessible homes. And specifically, there is a shortage of accessible housing in social housing, which is the tenure that disabled people disproportionately need and live in the most. We don't have to forget that disabled people are more likely to be living in poverty compared to non-disabled people. And if we look at just at London, over 30% of disabled Londoners live in social housing compared to 10% of non-disabled Londoners. So there is clearly a need of increasing the supply of accessible housing across all tenures, but specifically in social housing. And we think that the GLA, through planning, has a key role to make sure that we deliver not just more homes, but the right kind of homes for all, and we can also make sure that all barriers, disabling barriers to active travel and public transport are actually removed to make sure that all disabled people can live independently. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. That was really extensive and helpful. And I know that we had indications, I think, from Farah and Teri to come in on this. Please. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, hi, Farah, Head of Centre for Accessible Environments. We also sit within Habinteg Housing Association, which is known for its stock of accessible and adaptable homes. Part of CAE, and Centre for Accessible Environments, we've been running a service for 15 years, supporting London's third sector in terms of advice on access and inclusion. So just some of the themes we've picked up from the London's third sector might be useful as well, particularly around step-free access that Laura mentioned as well, the lack of accessible homes. This is about equity and equality. So if a lot of young people or people looking to get on the housing market, London is expensive. They want to move to commuter towns as well, but the lack of infrastructure of the transport system, we're not just talking about TfL, we're talking about the Network Rail service. So although post-COVID we've been able to work from home, there is a need also to come into London for offices as well. And so the holistic view around access to work, access to affordable homes, access to neighbourhoods and communities. So where, in terms of the planning, I mean, we at CAE often look at plans, multi-site plans coming in from local authorities. We're asked to review them. We're picking up themes such as, great, it's an accessible flat or apartment or home, but can they get out the door? Can they access their local services? How far away are they from their local accessible bus system? So the buses are generally much more inclusive within London, but the infrastructure around the buses, we've had many occasions where bus drivers won't even stop if they see somebody waiting at the bus stop. So there's a lot of challenges that disabled people have to make, and they don't want to spend their whole lives challenging every single shop or bus or train station. So wayfinding is a big issue within London as well. So planning their journeys. So if they're going from A to B, they need to have that information before. Typically it's on websites, but not always. And then historic buildings as well. That's often a challenge thrown back to access consultants or local authorities around, well, we can't make this change because it's a historic building. We at CAE, we've been into Westminster Abbey and we've made it more accessible, so we don't think it's a challenge that can't be overcome. There's always a way and a means. And just to say that we've also been training young disabled Londoners to enter this sector because there's a real lack of people who are making these decisions around planning, around buildings. So to have some support to actually encourage more disabled people to come into the sector, to have more representation in terms of diversity. Very commonly you might have heard the word reference man or reference woman, and typically you'll see in a lot of professions that people just don't have perhaps the training or the background of knowledge to really think a bit broader than their own reference points. So I think that's my key issues, and I'll pass over to Teri.
Thank you. And then I've seen Harriet and then Jane after.
So I think a lot of the points I was going to raise have been mentioned already, but just to look at it strategically for their day-to-day life, people with impairments are disabled because they cannot go from door to door when they want to go on a journey like everyone else. So even if maybe the bus system works for them, they get to a point where the train doesn't work, and most train stations are not accessible. Their domestic spaces which they inhabit are not accessible, and even when they're designed, sometimes there are shortcomings there. The public arena and spaces which they have to navigate in their daily life is not always accessible. And I mean, these elements represent people's everyday reality, at home and going out. And when you think about leisure and going around commercial spaces, they encounter those same problems. So every element of their day-to-day living is filled with issues and challenges. So we cannot say it's just one area or another. We have to look at it, systemically, and any solution will need to be, on a holistic basis. So I'll stop there, let others contribute.
Thank you, Teri. And it was Harriet and then Jane. Just make sure to have your mic on.
I think I pressed it on there.
Perfect.
Right, thank you. I'm Harriet Bell, and I'm here as a private individual, although I've worked in the heritage sector for over 30 years and currently working in access advice. In terms of specifics from my own point of view as a regular wheelchair and scooter user, I'd agree with everything that's been said already. I think there are specific things around scooters charging, storage, and room for scooters in lifts. There are 3 different classes of mobility scooter, and a lot of the lifts don't have enough room for the larger ones. That's a particular issue if you want to travel with another person as well. I think a lot of the built infrastructure only allows for you to be cared for as a disabled person and not to be a carer. I travel with my kids a lot, and when they were young I found that a particular challenge. Steps and thresholds are an endless, persistent problem absolutely everywhere across London and across the country as well. And I just don't know how to emphasise the importance of that and how easy it is for people to make the changes and how much they don't. Entrance doors, revolving entrance doors, immediately separate people with mobility impairments, and not just mobility impairments, out, and I think that they are a real problem, particularly for office buildings. And the availability of loos is something that hasn't been mentioned as well, in terms of the built environment, making sure that there are enough loos being built, that we know where they are. And my life is dominated by thinking about loos. It's not glamorous, but it's what makes life possible, actually. But in terms of heritage, I think I really hear what you're saying about people using built heritage as an excuse for not doing things. And I think there is a fearfulness in the heritage sector about how to address inclusive access, and a lack of awareness about it, and a lack of confidence about it. And I would really, really like to see some recommendations around showcasing good practice much more widely across the sector, not just for the high-end buildings. And we know how well it can be done in the attractions, but also across the more ordinary built environment, much of which we have, and we have to know how to adapt. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Harriet. And Jane.
Jane Wilmot. I'm a deaf person from Hammersmith and Fulham. I would like to agree with everything that's been said so far, but I would like to bring to the table the perspective from blind and visually impaired people that most of us never talk about. Blind and visually impaired people have great difficulty in navigating the built environment. They have to put up with staggered crossings. Do you have any idea how difficult staggered crossings are for blind and visually impaired people? The problem is, for them, there's no information on the ground to tell them which way to turn when using a staggered crossing. As sighted people, we can see where the stagger is, but they have no information, which is a real problem. And they have great difficulty in navigating bypass bus stops and cycle lane because they don't know where to cross, they can't hear the cyclists, and they're nervous. They really suffer from lack of tactile paving in the correct places, old-fashioned paving left because nobody bothered to take them out. And they suffer from pedestrian crossing with audible tone or tactile bleeps that don't work. It is regular occurrence. So really, we need to think about how blind people have to navigate the pavement. The pavement have to be clear. They don't want overhanging branches, and they don't want clutter. They don't want dustbins in the wrong place. And if I was a blind person, I'd be quite frightened. They're very brave people, you know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. And Hallie.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Hallie from Ruils Independent Living, a deaf and disabled people's organisation. I agree with all of the points made, and I just wanted to make a point about consistency and reliability of design elements that are meant to be accessible. So, for example, lifts, which are brilliant and provide access for so many, but often are poorly designed. Lift shafts are poorly designed and often out of service, so people are unable to plan ahead, or if they do plan ahead to make a journey, again, their journey has been interrupted, often without warning and any sort of notice ahead of time. So they arrive somewhere and suddenly they're not able to continue on their journey, and this goes exactly back to the kind of principle of inclusive design, making sure that the elements that are included are inclusive, but also they're consistently working. I think I also just wanted to make a point about the implementation of inclusive design. So often the policies and principles are in place and people understand them, but the implementation doesn't always get carried out in the correct way. So it's done in the letter of regulation, but not in the spirit. So it leads to absurd situations like accessible housing with adjustable height worktops that are glued in place on install, so they don't actually do what they're intended. So there are kind of situations like that are happening, and often behind the scenes, and it's not until people go to interact with those what are meant to be accessible designs, and then they're not accessible.
Thank you very much, Hallie. That was really substantial from the panel. I'm grateful for that. And I think to some extent we've answered the sort of subsection of my next question, which was going to be about the specifics of types of infrastructures that might pose barriers. I think we've covered that in terms of stations, lifts, bus stops. So I might move us on to the next two questions, which I think I'm going to combine so that I can give my members an opportunity to come in sooner as well. And this is around the London plan. So very grateful that the panel have sort of laid out the significant challenges that they face, or disabled Londoners face, in terms of the built environment. So moving on to, for instance, the London plan, could any of you tease out what you think in the London plan addresses accessibility and inclusivity in the built environment, and whether this has a sort of positive impact or a negative impact on disabled Londoners? I'm not sure who wants to start us off. Teri, you look like you're ready to go. Perfect.
I'm happy to go. And I don't think I properly introduced myself the last time. I'm representing the Design Council, but I'm also a registered access consultant. So the London plan, and we have to accept that good practice in inclusive design is constantly moving. So the London plan is a few years old and reflects its time. What is considered good practice now has moved on. So I use the section relating to housing design quite a lot because my practice undertakes that. And there is good intention there, but it is not always properly implemented everywhere. So I know that a lot of the social housing providers are really quite good with sticking to it and ensuring compliance. But when it comes to the private development, who may not be regulating themselves so much, then the outcome is not quite the same. And also, when we're thinking about developments where they agree car-free parking, people who are disabled by that because they're not providing adequate sort of parking quite close to their dwellings. There's a need for wheelchair for accessible housing, but we know that below a certain height, it's not really essential or provided, so there is a discrepancy there, and it may be future-proofing if it cannot be provided at the start. And also, any accessibility needs to be provided from the boundary of the site right into the dwelling, and not just starting with the dwelling, ensuring that other units within the facility can be visited by people who are disabled, and not just a particular unit which is meeting the criteria. So in that sense, it is working. In some of the other areas, others may have more experience, but in the public realm, it doesn't always occur. And even sometimes when you've achieved it, when maintenance occur, they do not carry the spirit of the inclusive design, and things are fitted which go against and that and ruin the good intentions of the original designers. I'll let others contribute.
That was really helpful, Teri. Thank you. Did I see an indication from Harriet? Perfect.
Sorry, I'm going to get used to this. Yeah, I agree very much. Obviously, the intention was very good. I think from looking at planning applications, one of the most useful hooks is the insistence on no disabling barriers. I think that's very important. I think perhaps what's missing is thinking about refurbishment. Again, so much of what we're looking at is refurbishing many historic and other properties across London. We're not in a situation where everything is new build, and it's important to have that hook in the London plan. I think I recognise what you're saying about the public realm. I think it's there if we want to use it. I think tightening up engagement as well at a very early stage needs to happen in the next version of the plan, because I don't think that it's there, but it's very much best practice type of wording, rather than it being an insistence upon that, and an insistence upon that being demonstrated through the development process as well by developers. I think that's a really important thing. But I do think it's been really helpful in terms of having policy D5 is really helpful to make developers pay attention, provided the local authority feels that it has the support to do so. And that's not consistent in my experience across the piece of working for 3 different ones in London.
Thank you. I mean, Harriet, can I just do a follow-up? What is it you think between those 3 local councils that you've worked on and the different ways that they've approached it? What do you think the difference was between them? What were these sort of additional circumstances?
I think there are different cultures. And I think perhaps there's a feeling that inclusive access is something for authorities within the central activities zone, perhaps more than the outer boroughs. Hammersmith and Fulham is generally seen as a beacon of good practice wherever you are. But otherwise, I think that's a pattern that I'm generalising about, but I think possibly represent things. And I think there is a reluctance to impose things on smaller medium-sized enterprises or in smaller developers. There's a sense that the financial burden is too great.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. Jen, I saw an indication from yourself. Jane, could we just get you to thank you?
I'm just getting my thoughts together. I think the London plan it's very good at the beginning of the process, the planning approval side, but it doesn't force the issue of how we end up at the end of the process with a building that is fully inclusive. There's so many ways of dropping the ball between giving a planning approval, and I would quite like the London plan to make it much more explicit that it's not enough to give planning approval. Somewhere along the line, the mayor has to set out planning at the beginning, approval at the beginning is one thing. But actually what you need is to follow it through. And many developers don't always follow it through because nobody's looking. Really. I don't know what we can do about this, but I've been involved in a big project in Hammersmith and Fulham from the planning approval right through to completion. And I've observed how many times people could drop the ball. Consultants not understanding inclusive design, the developer not making sure that the consultant and the contractors comply with inclusive design. So really it's about paying attention to detail. And I don't quite know how the London plan can change the culture there. Thank you.
No, it's a really helpful question to leave us with, Jane. Thank you. Are there any other contributions? Yes, we've got Farah and then Teri, or Teri and then Farah and then Hallie.
Yep, I wholly agree with Jane. And one of our recommendations was, as part of that process, from when the planning is granted, there's conditions within there may well be, but it's really down to building control. So typically you'll have a local authority building control officer, or you may have an approved building control officer, in the sense that they may be run by private companies, and that is where we would want some training or some sort of enforcement of things that Jane mentioned in terms of making sure that those are implemented. I was just going to add to that a lot of local authorities 10, 15 years ago would have an access officer who would be supporting a lot of this work that we're saying in terms of ensuring planning applications are reviewed. Some local authorities, such as Jane's one, have an access panel. Hammersmith and Fulham does. I think Newham has one which is also based on co-production. And the City of London has a COLAG as well, so which is more of a consultation one. We would wholly recommend that all local authorities have an access panel, primarily made up of disabled people and maybe access expertise as well. And you're seeing that in TfL and Network Rail. They also have set up access panels as well. I think a gap within the London plan is around student and hotel accommodation. And we're starting to see, because space is such a premium in London, even some apartments being built where they have some form of almost student living, where you may have private bedroom space and bathrooms, but shared living spaces. So we're sort of like looking at different standards and trying to work out, well, how do we assess this in terms of access? And data is king, really. So how do we measure the effectiveness of the London plan if data is not broken down into the protected characteristics? So that's going to be really critical for us and for London Assembly, really, to assess that. And 80% of homes and buildings are already built. So should we have something in there to sort of really target that area? It really frustrates me that the government puts a lot of effort into carbon neutral and money and funding behind it, but not, if they took the same effort and funding into inclusivity, we would be in a much more equal place.
Okay, thank you, Farah. Teri, Hallie, and Laura, and then I'm going to move us on.
Yeah, so we're just coming back briefly on the local authorities and different, cultures and practices. Sometimes it's to do with the funding, and so they have to be innovative in how they get the resources. I think it's Waltham Forest who have good practice. They have access consultant embedded in the planning department who looks at all the planning applications, and I think they may be funded by SIL. And we know that the planners themselves may not be knowledgeable to be able to review the designs. They probably need to upskill themselves to some kind of basic level and then be able to have the resources to call on internally, as well as maybe external panels to look at it. But with anything which is out there, you may have the best policy, but if it is not carried through, then it's just words on paper. So I think it's tackling the process, and I know that the RIB has recently come up with a plan in which you embed inclusion and accessibility right at the outset of the project through to completion. It may be a bit too complex for simpler projects, but at least there's something out there which is good practice that anyone can use right at the start to ensure it's embedded in their project. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And I think some of what we're straying into now will be questions that other members in the committee will ask. So I'm just going to refocus us back on just the London plan specifically and, aspects of it that we think of, the impact it has on disabled Londoners.
Yes, I mean, several of the points I was going to make have been made, but I just want to reiterate the importance of accountability, at the end of the process and throughout to kind of stay in line with the London plan. So there are a lot of great intentions there, but we are seeing planning authorities passing many submissions for refurbishment that actually degrade accessibility, so replacing ramped entrances with steps and then having a lift alongside them rather than keeping something that was already accessible, which is, this is then it's challenging to then go back and say, actually, the previous design was more inclusive, and there's a lack of engagement and co-production with local deaf and disabled people. So actually embedding co-production into the London plan and saying, this is best practice. I think Jane said in her previous report, this is the golden thread. This should be done at the very start before any plans are even being made. There should be engagement with the deaf and disabled people that it's going to most directly impact. And really crucially have a broad representation of deaf and disabled people, because we know that some things may work for some things may not work. A great example of this is zebra crossings and pelican crossings. Both are different options, but they're not accessible to all disabled people. So it's coming up with innovative solutions, but part of that process of coming up with these solutions is co-production. You need the voice of deaf and disabled people to tell you their experience and from their perspective what will work and what won't.
Brilliant, thank you, Haley. And then Laura, did you want to come in on this? Of course.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what everyone has just said. Great stuff. But I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the policies which are in the London plan, such as policy D5 on inclusive design, which we really welcome as a policy, because it basically says that all development proposals need to submit a design and access statement, and then needs to be accompanied by an inclusive design statement. So in principle, that is great, but the policy needs to be implemented locally, otherwise there's no point of having a policy in place. So what we see is that there is a limited understanding sometimes amongst developers, the regulatory profession, the construction profession, even local authority around what inclusive design principles are, what they mean in practice. And unfortunately, as Haley and others were talking about, there isn't meaningful co-production with deaf and disabled people locally. And what that means is that we end up designing places which are discriminatory by design, and we build inequalities into places while we could prevent that if we just spoke to people locally. So I just want to say that. And the last point is, we do not think that inclusive design is really a strategic priority of the London plan, so maybe this is what should happen in the next iteration of the London plan. And if I just look at housing, for example, why do we have as KPIs the supply of affordable homes and the supply of new homes as KPIs, but the supply of accessible homes is not a KPI? Surely, disabled people want to see how many homes, accessible homes, are being built each year and how many we need every year, right? So we need to make sure that the success of the London plan is also measured against the number and the quality of accessible homes that are being built. So I'm going to stop there.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Lara. Over to Asenwa Baker now.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks, panel, for your answers so far. And some of the things I'm going to raise you have covered, but please feel free to add or refer. All good. So my first question is about more recent developments, and it's to Farah, Teri and Jane, although the rest of the panel may have views. In your view, how well have the principles of inclusive design been implemented in recent developments in London?
I'll say it's mixed, and it depends on the passion of the designers or the developer. One good example which I'd like to highlight is the new headquarters for the RNIB, and that obviously incorporated not just the usual provision for disability, but included neurodiversity, which is one thing people are taking increasingly on board. So that's a shining example. Another one, which is a bit older, which received a CIC Inclusive Design Award, is actually the offices of Camden Council. I think that's 5 Pancras. And that was really excellent in its wayfinding, because quite often people are talking about accessibility, but this was one where the use of colors was able to differentiate the different floors, and that assists not just those with visual impairments, but also those whose English may not be their first language. You go to the blue floor, go to the green floor, makes life much easier. So if you get design right for the people with impairment, it works for a wider range of people. So I'm sure others may have more examples.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Teri. Farah?
Yeah, I just wanted to add into that what we're seeing is, obviously, if they ask CA to come in, they're already more than halfway there. But I absolutely agree with Teri, and there seems to be a really strong focus on neurodiversity in terms of buildings. Our sort of work, and I'm sure Teri and whoever else provides advice, we're pan-disability. We look at everything. But it's great to see some things being focused on. What we're seeing sometimes is, so in terms of the London plan, you have the 90% category 2, or the sort of accessible and adaptable, and then there's 2 categories within category 3, which is the accessible homes. So one is that it is built for a wheelchair user, but there may be some adaptations to be made, and there's one that they can just move into straight away. So the one where the adaptations, sometimes we find it's a huge retrofit, which is not the purpose of it. So that is possibly where, some, in terms of the planning officers, need to really check that, and also the people who are involved in terms of signing that off as well. Typically, we're seeing developers come to us and say, well, yes, we've got the London plan, we have to build 10% of our homes here to wheelchair accessible, but we can't find the people to actually move into them. And so you may sometimes see in a condition to say for a year they have to market them. But how do they market them? Commonly they say, well, we don't know. So, Habitec's doing some work around that, but there's a real lack of, Rightmove or, social housing providers, how can they do that? So there's something that CA and Habitec are doing, which is a publication with REBA publishers to look at the specification and the fit out of a home once it's gone through planning. So I think this will help, but a real need for sort of training advice and some good practice examples of how homes have been marketed, and for the end user to know, where do I go to find these homes? So pass over to the others.
Thank you. Jane, did you have anything to add? So.
Thank you very much. I think in Hammersmith and Fulham, we've done quite well in making sure that applications and approvals are accessible and inclusive. But I would like to quote a couple of examples where we've done really well. The council had a big project to redevelop their civic campus. And this had been a major project for 6 or 7 years. And I've been very privileged to be the co-chair of that project as a local disabled resident. And what we managed to achieve is to inspire everybody, the developer, the council, and their housing association partner, to be totally accessible and inclusive. And we've coined the phrase, being ruthlessly inclusive. And that means everybody had to be ruthlessly inclusive. The other thing we've inspired people about is not dropping the inclusive design ball throughout the whole process. And that really has changed things, because it means that not for a positive environment for disabled people in any building, it depends on 50% is down to design. But 50% is how you manage the building, how you make the building welcoming, and we manage to inspire the people who are going to be running the building that they've got to be accessible and inclusive. And to think about how people enter the building, how people who have neurodiversity, who might be anxious, and how you provide a quiet space. That had to be found. Things like that. So quite exciting to work on this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just wanted to, and thanks for Jane and Teri there for giving specific examples. Does anyone else have any examples of good practice when it comes to inclusive design that they'd like to raise that they haven't already? Harriet?
This is to do with public realm, but the City of London Streets Accessibility Tool, sorry, garbled my words there, is very good, because I think it recognises a range of impairments, and the fact that there is not necessarily one catch-all design solution. But I think that's a very good example.
Thank you. Hallie?
Yes, I wanted to raise an example that's currently happening at the moment with TfL. They're doing an accessible crossing trial at Manor Circus in Richmond. And they are employing technology called Smart Cross to make the crossings more accessible for all users. So in this specific example, a zebra crossing was being turned into a pelican crossing, which was not accessible for people who are unable to use push buttons. So TfL have because there was engagement and co-production with local disabled people, TfL recognised that this was going to be a problem for quite a few people who were using that local crossing, and they now have the Smart Cross box installed on the temporary crossing, so that there's a whole trial period for the next 9 months while the works are happening, with the goal that this is employed across London. It's something that was already being done in Hull City Council, and then they've taken that principle and applied it here. And at the moment it is a pilot, but of course we're hopeful that it will, turn into something that will help all Londoners be able to access crossings. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Haley. So my next question is around, again, it's probably to Farah, Teri and Jane, but again, please come in. In your experience, are London plan policies on accessibility being translated effectively into local plans across London?
If I could come in there, because Havintech has done a bit of research on this. London Plan itself is brilliant. We always reference it when we're speaking to other local authorities as a great example of 90% and 10%. But within London local authorities, I think the data that we looked at, less than around 50% had actually translated it. And there's a lot of ambiguity. And in terms of local authorities, I think from what I've seen, and I have previously worked in a local authority as well, is a lack of data. So if you're forecasting ahead in terms of the need for wheelchair accessible homes, surely you should have that data from your children and young people's teams, your early years, and you're not just thinking of the individual, you're thinking of the family. So it's the tenure of what's available as well in terms of wheelchair accessible homes. The other thing that we're picking up is a bit of I think it's a lack of confidence in terms of where do they place these homes. If you're looking at an apartment block, sometimes they're placed all on the ground floor, and we ask for a choice, not just of where you live, but a view of where you live as well. So it shouldn't all be on the ground floor, and that's a real issue, I think, in terms of for people wanting to choose where they want to be. But yeah, I think that was my main points to start with. I'm sure something else will come up, but we'll let someone else come in.
No worries. Thank you, Farah. Teri.
So I feel that on the new build developments where the local plans are mirroring the London plan, then the requirements, are better implemented. But quite often when you come to refurbishment and things like that, then it's not so rigorously enforced. And the standards of access statements that you find varies. There are people who've got, proper information within theirs, maybe done by a specialist and haven't consulted with others. And then there's some which are really quite light, and both standards are accepted. So maybe we need greater rigor in the contents of the access statements that are being accepted, and maybe they are sent back, quite up to the standard. So again, the mechanism is there, but the process through which it's implemented is not always so effective in practice.
Thank you. Jane.
I can confirm that in Hammersmith and Fulham, the London plan policies have been included in their local plan and in their planning SPD, because my group insisted on it.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks. I thought that might be your answer. Oh, no more.
What I would say is what actually the London plan is only focusing on new builds. And I think that is a mistake with hindsight. Because actually, what really matters is what are we doing with existing buildings. And I know in Hammersmith and Fulham, they're making a big effort to retrofit their council stock, because there have been so many complaints that when people move in, it doesn't work. I have to say, like every local authority, their housing department is not great. They're too used to the old-fashioned way of working. They're not really used to working with people. But we have a new director of housing who's absolutely committed to changing that. So it will take time. Top of the list is repairs, as you know. So really, we're doing our best in Hammersmith and Fulham. We don't always get it right, but that's where we are.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Farah.
Sorry, could I just come in there? That's a really useful point about retrofitting. Something that I think we could start with social housing providers is, do you know your own stock? And quite often they're quiet. We have the same issue with Inhabinteg. So when they send building surveyors or whoever they send around to do stock conditions surveys, can we put a few access questions in there as well? It's not a big ask. It maybe add another 5 minutes if we're looking at some key issues. You don't know how to improve if you don't know the state of what you currently have.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Okay, sorry, Teri.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on that point of maintenance and the fact that we don't actually have a joined up process. So maybe there's a budget for maintenance and it's just for this, whereas if you were looking at accessibility at the same time, that budget could be used more effectively across a lot of areas. So that's nothing to do with the London plan. It's to do with how organizations operate. And it's not just housing organizations, it's the large infrastructure companies as well.
I think that's a really good point. Is it embedded in everything that's done, or is it done as a separate accessibility done separately? Thank you very much. I just want to return now to transport. I know we touched upon it quite a lot already because I know how important it is, but just to make sure we've talked about it. You've had an opportunity to say everything you'd want to. So I'm going to start with Jane, but then anyone who has any responses. Are there any specific recommendations or changes you would propose to enhance accessibility in London's transport system?
You're putting me on the spot.
I can come back to you, Jane, if you'd prefer. Sorry. Thank you.
There are two main areas. Tube stations, of course. I don't have to say much about that. We all know what the issues are. But the other thing that really matters to disabled people is the pedestrian environment, how you cross the roads, basically. And there are so many different issues to think about. Blind and visually impaired people, deaf people who might not hear how quickly the cars are coming, people with autism, neurodiversity, who are not very confident. And actually, what I've been trying to talk about in Hammersmith and Fulham is doing something to reorganize the priority as outlined in the highway code. Disabled pedestrians at the top, able-bodied pedestrians next, bus users, ambulances, commercial vehicles, the motorists at the end. What needs to happen now is to redesign the roads to reflect these priorities. And the conversation's only just beginning. And I'm just sort of saying, well, what can we do to slow down the motorists, but support all the other people who need to use the highway? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. That's really helpful. Does anyone have anything else on transport that we haven't raised before? So Farah and then Harriet.
Yeah, I just wanted to just declare another one that I'm chair of the Network Rail Access Panel, so I'll bring in some of the insight there as well. One of the key things, not just local authorities, but even public bodies like TfL, Network Rail, they should be doing an equality impact assessment. We've seen some really poor examples of that, and within Network Rail there's a big piece of work around diversity impact assessment, same thing, making it digital, making sure there's peer reviewers, and for us at the panel really scrutinising, have you really thought through some of the data that you're presenting there, looking at things like the census, really assessing your demographics in that area as well. Those are key things that people are missing out. Step free obviously is a really big issue within transport system. Sometimes I've been on some of the underground system. There may well be a lift, but it's like a mile away in terms of the distances they have to travel. There's no points of rest along the way as well. So these are real issues that they may tick the box, but let's really look at that. And quite often lifts go out of order, and when they're planning, that should be an immediate thing that goes up on their Twitter or website or whatever. And you may have seen recently in the news around the potential closure of ticket offices that the government backed down on. Actually, they were the ones that wanted it to happen in the first place. So, people power is really important, and listening to the voice of disabled people is so critical. So it's nice to see one example where they actually did listen as well.
Thank you, Farah. Harriet. Sorry, could you? Yeah.
Right, that's better. I've got a few things. One of which is crossing speeds at crossings. I know that there's been an amendment recently on that, but I think that is a very exclusive practice, particularly in some of the central areas where there's not enough time for many of us to cross. I've already mentioned more room in lifts and the vertical movement. A movement away from shared surfaces, I think that shared services seem to be a persistent thing. I had hoped they'd have gone out of fashion by now, recognising what happens there, but I think being clearer about that in the London plan would be really helpful. Vehicle charging, electric vehicle charging, there's the new publicly accessible standard on that, but I think also mobility scooter charging, it is a real barrier to movement. If you haven't got places to charge your scooter, you just don't go out because you don't want to break down. And wayfinding, particularly points of arrival into London, people coming in as visitors, it's a confusing environment and it needs to be consistent, which Hallie's mentioned, but consistent wayfinding right across the piece, but making sure it's particularly emphasised at the stations and places where people come in. Having got lost twice on the way in the last 2 days to City Hall, I can speak to that.
A note for us, perhaps, yes. Thanks. Teri and then Hallie.
Yeah, so 2 points I wanted to raise. I mean, the first one is that we're all sort of familiar with the notion of transport hubs, where, you know, there's the intersection of buses and trains and things, but quite often those are quite distant from the homes of, you know, local people. So what we need to start to think is maybe another approach in having, you know, sort of a lower category of nodes whereby, you know, in those locations, then they're fully accessible, and then from there you could get to the hub. Otherwise, people are having differing distances they have to travel to get to an accessible, you know, transport location, and they're having to pay a lot more using taxis and things to achieve that. The other thing to raise is actually night time, because daytime, you know, it's easier to access and travel, but at night time it's more difficult. Wayfinding, it's more difficult, you know, there's the safety issues and things. So we need to consider both day and night, otherwise some people will just decide not to go out at certain times of the day. Thanks,
Teri. Hallie, and then Farah.
Yes, that was absolutely a point I was going to make, and I think additionally, kind of on top of the different hours that people are either able to travel or restricted to travel in, there's a big reliance on people. People are a part of this as well. So you could have the most inclusive design, but if it relies on people to utilize that design properly, and they're not understanding or empathetic, and the attitudinal change isn't made, then that can be a real barrier, and especially thinking, you know, bus drivers, people working at ticket offices. You know, there's 2 things that need to happen. We need to start by having the built environment reflect the changes that we want to see in attitudes, but there's some upskilling, there's some training, and there's some general empathy that is lacking. There are some good things that are happening with, you know, co-production with local bus companies to help drivers understand the needs of disabled people, but they're often limited by their roles. So there's kind of an intersectional need often for disabled people, but there's also the needs of the drivers. So there are a lot of competing interests. So having that attitudinal change addressed would be a good place to start.
Thank you. Farah?
Yeah, good points raised there. We often see excuses for a lack of accessibility because they're bringing in security or antisocial behaviour, but it's not really an excuse. I just wanted to add into these points around egress. So we talk a lot about access getting in, but also the getting out is really important as well. And there is a British standard that applies to rail infrastructure around self-evacuation. I would really like to see that implemented everywhere, so not relying on refuges. Really, if you're building something new or refurbishing, you're spending millions of pounds. You know, there should be no excuse for having to then design in a refuge. We should always be looking at, as far as possible, to self-evacuate everybody. There should be no reliance on fire services. And any lifts being put in should really be fire evacuation lifts. I know it's more money, but, you know, it's equality.
Thanks very much. That's really important. Laura?
Yeah, I just want to echo what has been said already, but add that in addition to prioritising investment in step-free access tube station, what we also would like to see is an investment in zero-emission buses with enhanced accessibility features, such as those where we have a bigger access space so that we make sure that more than one wheelchair user can get on the bus, and we avoid conflict with buggies. This is often a big problem that is raised to us, so I just wanted to say that. And then cycling infrastructure needs to be accessible for all disabled people. Bus stops need to be safe and accessible. We want to raise the fact that we need to hold the development of bus stop bypasses until there is meaningful engagement with DDPOs and deaf and disabled individuals, because that hasn't happened. And I think this is a big problem. And I think Hallie was talking about training, right? We need to make sure that all staff receive disability quality training delivered by deaf and disabled people and based on the social model of disability, rather than what is happening at the moment, which is an EDI training not delivered by disabled people and not based on the social model of disability. So this is not equality. This is a tick box exercise, and it's a problem. And then adequate bus infrastructure. Nobody's mentioned toilets. Sorry, you mentioned toilet. Free, accessible, and changing place at toilets at tube station, not just when the London plan addresses this and says that large development proposals need to make sure that there is provision of accessible and changing places toilets. But what about tube station? Are there any toilets there? Are they open? Can be used by people with wide variety of impairments. There is signage. People don't know where the toilets are, so this needs to be improved. And last point I want to make, the transport chapter states that 80% of all journeys need to be made by active travel, which means walking, wheeling, or cycling, which we agree with, but there must be some recognition in that chapter that some people, because of their impairments, cannot, unfortunately, walk or wheel or cycle. So we want to make sure that any sort of policies that promotes active travel is based on the idea that some people with impairments cannot really, use public transport, for example, and because otherwise we still create disabling barriers to disabled people. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Really, really important points there, Lara. Cheers. And back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Over to Assemblymember Berry.
Excellent. Can I, sorry, Chair, can I ask one follow-up question on the transport side of things? Because I think what Jane said, can you give Jane a nudge for me? Thank you. What Jane said about the hierarchy of road users was really, really interesting, that disabled pedestrians should be above pedestrians as a group, as a whole, as a separate category. And then the point that Lara just made, which is that there are disabled people who are dependent on their cars, and the current hierarchy puts that at the bottom. Where shall we put disabled car-dependent people in that hierarchy, and does that create problems for planning for road space? Jane, sorry, that's a really tricky question. But have you thought about where to put the disabled car drivers?
Instinctively, I would put them at the top with the disabled pedestrians. That's where I would put them, because they're the biggest issue blue badge holders. In fact, in Hammersmith and Fulham, the council created a cycle lane, which meant there were fewer parking opportunities on King Street. We negotiated with the council the concept of 3-hour blue badge parking bays in adjacent street, very close to the shopping centre. And this is just about to be implemented, so we'll see if that works. Because we had to come up with something, because blue badge holder was saying we can't park. And it's too far to walk from the multi-storey car park to the shopping centre. So we'll see if this works.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. So there was the conflict about the road space on the main road, and then you negotiated a mitigation on the side road, essentially, for that. Great. Okay, thank you so much. And go on, Farah, because I'm wondering how to codify this without creating.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. We've done. You may have seen post-COVID or during COVID these low-traffic neighbourhood zones. You know, the planters.
I'm well aware of those. Thank you.
So one of the things we recommended when we did an equality impact of that was some of these restrictions were allowing emergency vehicles through. Some people are absolutely reliant on their car, and so that was one thing that we requested. So I suppose we were elevating them to the level of emergency services.
Yes, exactly, and that's where you've got camera controls that can be dealt with. Yeah, so it's that's really helpful, and I think, you know, it's one of those things where we have to be using the process right to get these mitigations and difficulties sorted at the beginning. Harriet, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Just quickly to follow on from that point, there are also a lot of people who don't identify as disabled who may have mobility impairments, who are reliant on cars as well. So that's something I think that needs to be factored into this thinking.
Yes, exactly. So people who don't necessarily have an official status as a disabled person, but nevertheless car reliant. Yeah, exactly that. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for those. And I'll move on to my real questions now. So what I'm trying to get to the bottom of here is some recommendations we might make towards the next London plan. And I know you've all mentioned some quite useful areas. You've talked a lot about process, and different Assembly member is going to ask you about that in a moment. So not asking for new policies around process right now. But I was very interested that a number of you brought up the fact that we need more policies around refurbishments, not just new builds. And I was wondering if potentially Teri, to start, might give us some more detail about that. And the other question was about the sort of demographics of this and whether we're going to need more accessible housing, more wheelchair accessible housing, more that meet the standards that have been set out in the future, and whether the 10% and 90% target needs to be shifted so that maybe more of the homes that we're building now are wheelchair accessible. So Teri, any recommendations for new policies?
Yeah, so 2 points. I've been in the housing business long enough to remember the time of lifetime homes, you know, when you were designing everything that people didn't have to move, you know, later in life. And I think that's the M42 category. And if that could be the standard, the minimum standard, so we're future-proofing everything new that we build. It just means slightly more space, you know, at the beginning. The other thing is to do with the refurbishments, because we know most properties already exist. People are usually extending and altering. Why can't we sort of require greater accessibility in those designs so that we are dealing with the existing stock at the same time? And it just means that if people think about it at the outset, it's designed differently, and you know, you're creating an extension, and you know, people can be able to come into it without steps. You know, it's things like that. So it's addressing the new as well as the existing. I think there was a third point which I can't remember now. I'll probably come back.
I mean, should we be increasing the 10% as well? That was the question.
Yeah. So the 10%. Could be increased, but we hear that sometimes they cannot find residents to purchase it. Certainly in social housing, there's never a fact that you cannot find residents for those, you know, because there's always a waiting list. But if we are creating more which are future-proofed so that they could be altered to cater for people with impairments at a later stage, then we're doing more than the 10%, because we're doing 10% at the 3 category, and then we're doing more at the 2 category, and doing less of the visitability, because those ones you cannot really upgrade at a later date, because it's just the toilet which is the accessible thing, and quite often they not are. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Who else would like to to join in with policy bids. Farah,
yes,
you first,
I
and
would
then Jane.
absolutely advocate going above the 10%. Even in London, there's a real lack of housing for wheelchair users. We have so many anecdotal, we have stories from people saying that they're stuck in nursing homes or, in inappropriate homes, or not able to move out, young people, because they just can't find the places. The rental sector is a real challenge. I don't know if there's something within the London plan that you can advocate to really support the rental sector. I myself had a team member who was forced out of London because she just couldn't find a home. I mean, she was in a lifetime home standards rental place, but then when she needed to move because the landlord put the price up, she just couldn't find something. And so we've lost her out of London. But I do think, we've done some research with having taken around the cost of building an M4 Cat 3 home. It's not a lot of money. Our data was showing something like 25K. Even if you build these homes, they're larger homes. They have better lighting in them. They're great marketing for whether you're a wheelchair user or not. So we're not going to lose anything by advocating for greater standards. The baseline will become M4 Cat 2. We know that. It's just a question of when. So let's now focus on the wheelchair accessible standard and how we can implement that, and why not London? You could be leading on sort of nationally. You already are in some aspects, but why not go further?
In terms of the amount by which we should increase that target, then, are you basically saying to 100% ultimately, or as an interim step, what would you suggest?
I think incrementally, if we went for 15%, that would be a good start. And then, really key to all of this as recommendation is your data. So I know people have mentioned that, how many of these accessible homes are being built, and critically, how many are actually being used by the end user. That's something we'd really appreciate, to have that knowledge base, and that can inform the next review of the London plan.
Great, thank you. Jane?
I actually think we might want to revisit this whole subject, because at the moment, wheelchair units are distributed across all tenures. I'm going to be talking about market tenures, where there's a scandal, actually, because developers have to include wheelchair units for sale. And they wanted their normal practice is to sell properties off-plan. No self-respecting wheelchair user would ever buy a property off-plan because they can't visit it. My experience from listening to wheelchair users, they want to visit the property before they are going to put down their hard-earned money. But most wheelchair users can't even afford them. So actually, the idea that developers must have a range might need to be revisited. I would quite like the Mayor of London to investigate who's living in these wheelchair units, because actually, if nobody's buying them, no wheelchair user is buying the market one because they can't afford it, what's the point? Really, perhaps we should make a shift to wheelchair units, increasing the number of wheelchair units in social housing, which is affordable. But that is quite a big shift in policy. So probably we need evidence. We need to look into it. In Hammersmith and Fulham, we've got a project where I am determined that the market wheelchair unit available for sale should be sold to wheelchair users. And my group had negotiated that instead of allowing the council, who is the developer, to use the off-plan period as part of the target, they should do it after the building completed, when people can visit, for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, they will reconsider whether to extend it for a second 6 months or not. This had an impact on viability, so it had to be discussed. But at least we're talking about it, which is the important thing. Thank you.
No, that's really helpful, and obviously we'll have the Deputy Mayor and the team responsible for the next London Plan in, and they can be quite creative about these kinds of bits of guidance and conditions. I think you're suggesting, Jane, as well, potentially, that if a home can't be afforded and therefore is not being sold, then potentially that could be converted to a different tenure instead of just not built. Is that correct? No, I mean, yeah, so they're not... So can you put your microphone on?
They disappear.
So they're not built currently if they can't be sold?
The mayor is not getting his 10% wheelchair housing.
Yeah. But if instead of that they could be converted to an affordable tenure in the event that they're not sold, that would give a strong incentive for the market provider to sell them, to market them harder.
You have to make that watertight.
We'll talk to the Deputy Mayor about that anyway. I had one more question about something that was raised earlier to do with how people find their homes, and I'm trying to remember who brought this up, but basically what information is there on things like Rightmove or the council allocations policies about what is available at different levels of accessibility of existing stock? Particularly for renters. Does anyone have anything they want to recommend about that? It's not necessarily a London Plan policy, but it's something I wanted to follow up and ask for, what would you like us to recommend?
Farah here. Just to say that I know Rightmove is trying to add more features on their search facilities, but as far as I'm aware, I know that we at Habintech have tried to get this off the ground in terms of council available stock. There's nothing really formally out there, and I do believe it's just a question of trying to bring together the right people. And again, it could be just a lack of data and a lack of resources at a council level to make that happen. But it's so key in all of this.
And you, I think, and I remember it was, I think I've written down, add it into the stock condition surveys.
Yes,
that was you.
Absolutely, yes.
Right, thank you.
And even for us at Habintech, we've acquired stock that was built, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, we don't really know what standard that was built to. So for us to go back in and do that is really critical. And even for us to then have those conversations with councils as well is critical. Sometimes you'll have a home which is accessible, but actually it's on a really steep hill. So, those kind of things are really critical for people to know if they're going to assess a home.
And then, sorry, Haley.
I just wanted to make a point. I think as a local deaf and disabled people's organisation, a lot of time our members or local people who are struggling to find homes will come to us directly because there's not other external support, and in finding a home that is accessible isn't just about finding the property. It's going to view the home. They might need somebody to be an advocate or support for them to understand whether they're buying a home or to bridge the gap between the social housing provider and themselves. I also wanted to make the point that we've supported quite a few people recently who have become disabled, and the home that they're living in is no longer accessible to them. So they're going through the process of finding a new home, and these homes they don't exist. We supported a student who recently graduated from uni, who became a wheelchair user in uni and was accessing the halls, and then came out of uni and had nowhere to go and had to apply for through the homelessness process. So there are real issues, and a lot of them are really nuanced. Not everyone's experience is the same, and not every home will work for everyone. Even if there is an accessible home, we often take people to see these homes and they're like, actually, this won't work for these reasons. Additionally, we've had people trapped in their homes because they've become disabled and they don't have a ramp, and that ramp's not being retrofitted by the social housing provider, and they're having to go through the disabled facilities grant process, which for one person we've recently been supporting, she's been trapped in her home for 2 years because of this process. And recently had to crowdfund to raise the money, nearly 9 grand on a 30 grand income for that household. They were expected to pay 9 grand to get their house retrofitted. So there are real kind of problems within the policy, but also within the support structures that are meant to help people get into the accessible homes. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all my questions for now.
Thank you, Senator Berry. Over to Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Just before we start, I think everyone's kind of picked up on this as we've gone along, and it's the kind of inclusivity in the round. And I know this conversation's very much around, disabilities, but when things are inclusive, they're inclusive for everyone. And I think that's something that's a really important point that a lot of you have been making. It rarely makes, well, I can't think of any example where something is worse because it's been made more inclusive, be that, pavements, roads, the transport network, homes. I think that those are really good points coming through. I wondered if I could circle back to transport a little bit before the next questions, and specifically in relation to a couple of areas in the London plan. And firstly, in relation to car parking on sites and the breakdowns of spaces per development and disabled bays or spaces per development, and the breakdown of that between central, inner and outer London, and whether any of the panel want to speak to whether they think those are the right breakdowns, or we should be seeing any change in that in future London plans. If anyone wanted to. Harriet. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, I'll come back to you, Teri, if that's okay. Thank you.
I think it's a false situation, because I think we recognise that if you need to use a car because of your impairments, you need to use a car wherever you are, and it is a barrier if you have a limit on the number of people who can be in any one place at any one time. As a consequence of that, so I'm uncomfortable with it as a process, and as a person who's very reliant on car use myself. My condition is variable, so there are times when I am absolutely reliant on the car, and it seems to me an artificially imposed constraint that it is a barrier in and of itself.
Thanks, Harriet. Teri, did you want to come in now? Sorry about that.
Yes, I wanted to mention, the BS 83000, which has some proportions of spaces, for parking, for disabled parking, accessible parking, but obviously that proportion relates to what's actually there, because if it's 5% of 5, that's different from 5% of 100. So we need to look at the overall quantity which we align, and I know that it's greater the further out you go, because quite often the transport links are not quite so close as the inner boroughs. But again, in the inner boroughs, there are those who still need the use of their car. I mentioned before, the car-free developments are not always best. So I think each development probably needs to be reviewed on its own basis, and maybe some sort of variance agreed. There has to be something within the plan to allow for those specific situations. Otherwise, if you're just reading according to the plan, then certain people are excluded. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I advocate the sort of 5%. I think something else that's sometimes missed, for example, at station car parks, is, yes, 5%. And as Teri said, we don't know what that is of the total number. But making sure it's accessible, not just in terms of the EV charging, because there's a strong move towards electric cars, so making sure there's EV charging points, and in the standard bays as well, to make sure that those EV charging points are accessible as well. And don't forget, if staff are also using those bays as well, if any of them, as a reasonable adjustment, has asked for an accessible bay, that should be on top of the 5% as well. Generally, the points that we raised before around making sure that there's close enough. So if it's a housing development, making sure it's within, ideally 50 metres and close enough for people to use. And that's, in terms of getting from the car back to their home as well.
Thanks. I was I'll come to you in a second, Harry, but just if we focus as well on the residential limits, in a future London plan, should they be done away with perhaps more, with boroughs able to determine what is appropriate and what is not, or should they be raised in the London plan, more in terms of residential? I don't know if anyone could come in on that. Harriet, you wanted to add something though?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly come back on the station parking thing, areas where there are sort of transport hubs, because often you'll find, and I think this is what I meant about the absolute numbers, that if you don't get to a place by 8 in the morning, you have no hope of parking there. And I even with 5%, I have concerns about that being sufficient, and I think perhaps we should be looking at being actively more generous in those locations. So I just wanted to follow up on that.
Thanks. And not building over all the station car parks in London as well would be a good idea. Thanks. But was on the residential point, did anyone? Yeah, thanks.
I just want to say, if we're building wheelchair accessible homes, then really there should be some parking within close enough distance for people to use it.
Thanks. So at the moment, there will always be disabled bays, be it central, inner and outer, but the amount of bays obviously restricted through the numbers on the London plan. I wanted to just quickly, and we touched on it as well, about floating bus stops, because it's important to note, obviously, the TfL have just done their, released their evidence. I don't know if anybody sat on those forums here. I've heard some feedback, and it's not great about that. But going forward, I mean, what would the panel like to see in terms of the built environment and floating bus stops?
No, I mean, we've had feedback from disabled people ourselves in terms of equality impact, that they're not safe for people to use. There's a real risk of collision. There's a real risk in terms of people who are blind or visually impaired being able to sort of navigate those spaces as well. So it's not something we would advocate.
Is that, yeah? Go on.
I would endorse that. Actually, what I think we need is Transport for London to have a co-production group to actually look at it. Because at the moment, the national guidance didn't think about blind and visually impaired people. I'm quite sure of that. And I don't think Transport for London did either, because they were following the national guidance. So what we really need now is for us to get together and talk about the issues. It's not going to be easy, but we've got to talk about it and come up with a better way of doing it. And mitigation. It affects a lot of people. And it partly because people were very worried about cyclists. And really, the problem with cyclists, they were getting killed by lorries in central London. And we are having to pay the price for it. Because Transport for London and the government are very keen to make cycling safer for cyclists at the expense of pedestrians. So we need to talk about it.
Thanks. And it's a good time to introduce that kind of point about inclusivity to all, because I can tell you with small children that love the bus, they don't understand that when the bus comes, you don't just run straight on it. So it's one of those things, again, for everyone. Okay, I was going to ask, in terms of looking ahead to the next iteration of the local plan, has anyone on the panel been involved or engaged with the review process or discussions related to the built environment? Have you been involved, Harriet?
I've participated in the Planning for London programme, if that's what you mean.
Yes, and was that worthwhile discussions or?
Yes, I've participated in 3 separate sessions, including one on inclusive design yesterday. And I was disappointed, I have to say, by the level of attendance at the inclusive design one yesterday. It was very discouraging in terms of what people feel is valuable compared with the numbers that are there this morning, for which is what appears to be a separate event as part of the programme. I attended 2 separate strategic ones last year, and they weren't specifically on inclusive design and access, and I felt that it would have been helpful to have included inclusive design and access as an agenda item on every session. I think that would have been really helpful.
Just to confirm, Harry, when you say it's disappointing in terms of attendance, is that from stakeholders, developers, GLA officers?
There were a good number of GLA officers there, and I felt there was full commitment to the process. But there were, I understand that about 40 people had signed up and didn't turn up.
Right.
So I think that's indicative of a level of commitment from other should-be interested parties as well as stakeholders.
Okay.
It's disproportionately high.
Okay, thank you. Laura, did you want that?
Yeah, so I was at the event yesterday as well, and I shared the same concerns. I don't think I've seen many equality groups there, and I don't think it's because the equality groups didn't want to be there. It's because they weren't being contacted. So there hasn't been proactive engagement, and I think, the people in the London Planning for London programme really need to reach out properly to different equality groups, which is not just disabled people. There are many infrastructure organisations in London, like the LGBT plus consortium, EU Better Initiative, Women's Resource Centre. There are so many infrastructure organisations that could have been there, but I don't think they even knew that these events was even going on. I really want to stress, though, that consultation is not co-production. So I think these events are good, but we need to come to a point where we realise that we need to go to communities and understand what people's needs are, and do not expect people to provide feedback on a predetermined set of questions or topic. We need to come with a blank sheet of paper almost and ask what the needs are, and together work with solutions. And sometimes we don't feel that is happening, so we would actually like to see co-production happening. And Inclusion London is also a member of the London Housing Panel, which is also an initiative part of the Planning for London programme, and through that we and many other DDPOs are trying to make sure that accessibility is a key priority of the next London plan, or the next, we want to see more accessible homes being built anyway, but I'm just stop there. Thanks.
And I guess when you say co-production as well, make sure co-production actually is that, because I know there's a few TfL examples where people thought they were co-producing something that turned out quite differently. Just kind of building on that then, and great you two were at the forum yesterday. Is there any other mechanisms that anyone else on the panel wants to contribute to that engagement forums that would be helpful ahead of the next London plan? Was that a hand, Jane? Or?
I have to say, I didn't attend any of the groups because I wasn't sure how accessible it would be for me as a deaf person. I probably should have asked if they would provide a panel typist, but they didn't make it that welcoming for someone like me. I'm sorry about that. Co-production. What works when I've held a co-production event is to invite the disabled residents to say what the barriers are that they face, and then only after they've done that, allow officers to join the discussion, because that starts the process, and that changes the dynamic. And the other thing that's quite good is to have co-chairs. I was at a meeting last week, very interesting. We were talking to Transport for London about staggered crossing, because some of my blind members find it very difficult to use staggered crossing. And the Transport for London officer was saying, we're very inclusive. And my co-chair, who was an assistant director for the environment department, said, you're not really being inclusive because blind people can't actually use the crossings. So that was a really good example of an officer co-chair pushing back against other organisations. You need both.
Great. Thanks, Jane.
Just really quickly, I don't know if you're aware.
I would say the outcome of that, Transport for London agreed to look at the issue again for the first time ever.
Oh, good. Happy endings, hopefully.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware, but the Mayor of London set up a DDPO forum, which is an engagement forum that meets every kind of 3 months, and is made up of a wide variety of DDPOs in London. So that was supposed to ensure that there is meaningful engagement with deaf and disabled people around everything. Yeah, so that forum should be used to ensure there is strategic engagement. And, for example, it doesn't always work like that. So events like that yesterday, maybe channeled through the DDPO forum, would have been welcome.
Great. Yeah, Farah.
Could I just say, if you are thinking of any engagement events, is to reimburse members who do attend. It could be a nominal amount. There's various ways and means of doing it, but it's disabled people are over-consulted. If you look at any one time, how many different consultations are out there, and they have jobs, they have other commitments as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And are there any other recommendations or priority panel would like to see in the next London plan? And perhaps as well, if there's anything particularly you think must be retained as well. Yes, Teri.
So I think we need to have more examples of good practice. We also need to have maybe signposting of good practice publications, and also we need to reinforce the process, and I think Jane spoke about it. It's good at the beginning, but not always at the end, so that it is properly enforced all the way through, and the good intentions at the start, or at least what's stated, is carried through to the end. So there's got to be some process in there, or something to steer its implementation to ensure we get the outcome that we want.
Can I make a few comments on housing and how we could improve policies in the London plan, because I wasn't able to talk earlier. So I think, so I think there should be a focus on retrofitting the existing housing stock. So we should make sure that the accessible housing target do not just apply to new build homes, but also to extension, to acquisition. So the current mayor is, through the right to buy back scheme, or the new CHAP program, I think it's called, the Council Acquisition Program, is giving money to local authorities to buy back properties from the private rental sector to convert them into social rent homes. Can we make sure these homes are accessible? So maybe requiring as a funding condition that local authorities conduct an accessibility assessment of these homes when they are being acquired, and retrofit them to the highest accessibility standard. Also, I think people were mentioning this earlier, there is a difference between fully wheelchair accessible homes and wheelchair adaptable homes. A wheelchair adaptable home is not readily usable for a wheelchair user to move in. So the kitchen and the bathroom are not cannot be used unless they are adapted. And that means people have to apply through DFG, and local authorities spend lots of money, which is not really cost effective, to adapt new build homes that could be made fully wheelchair accessible. So I think we want to see targets being introduced for M43A and 43B, because we really want to monitor to what extent the wheelchair user homes which are being built are actually accessible, fully accessible or adaptable, because we are concerned that developers are more likely to be the wheelchair adaptable because it saves them money and it's not really cost effective for the public purse either, and not good for disabled people. Affordability was mentioned. We want to see, of course, accessibility across different tenures, but more accessible social housing. And so we think that the GLA should really monitor, when they monitor affordable housing starts and completion by type, how many of these are accessible. We don't know that. And to what extent these accessible homes that are being built are affordable. Again, we don't know that. The 10% applies across all tenures. So maybe a larger proportion of accessible homes should be in social housing. I wouldn't be able to tell you what percentage, and that's where data comes in. I think the GLA, we have analyzed the London Housing Strategic Market Assessment from 2017, and there is scarcity of data around people with protected characteristics more generally, LGBTQ+ people, ethnic minority communities, disabled people. So we need to make sure that the GLA captures the identified unmet housing need. We want to know what is the current situation in London, how many new or not new homes we need which are accessible. Why do we know just, for example, the Mayor of London said 66,000 homes are needed every year. Of these, a certain proportion needs to be generally affordable. Why can't we know how many are needed every year that are accessible? This is really key, important information. But if we don't have this information, how are we expecting even local authorities to plan and deliver the right kind of housing? We are quite skeptical. And I'm going to stop there because I've talked too much.
I guess the chair will say this, but anything that you feel has been missed today, obviously you can send in to us. Harriet.
Thank you. I would very much like to see something that speaks to intersectionality and also looks at scenarios so that the London plan considers the lives of disabled people in the whole. So we're not just existing in terms of a policy on housing or a policy on transport, but how we move across those policies and perhaps looking at different personas or scenarios in order to try and achieve that. It's not going to be complete, but it is a more qualitative set of testing measures that I think is needed for that, and I think that's quite absent from the plan at present.
Thank you. And just to say again, if you did want to let us know anything else, then do.
Thank you. And we'll move on to finally Assembly Member Fortune for this section before we aim for a 5-minute comfort break whilst we switch over panels.
Thank you. I'm Peter Fortune. I'm the Assembly Member for Bexley and Bromley. One of the advantages or disadvantages possibly of having the final set of questions is a lot of what you were going to ask has been answered, especially by such an informed panel. But I want to touch on some specifics, just so we've got it on the record. We have talked about consultation and what effective consultation looks like. Are there any further suggestions for how local authorities or any kind of planning authority can better consult so that we have more useful information coming into the process? So, Hallie.
Yes, I would just like to point out that most boroughs across London have a deaf and disabled people's organisation in them. Either they're representing just that borough, or in my case, Ruils works across 4 boroughs in southwest London. And there are multiple ways that you can engage with the DDPO in order to, one, reach the local disabled people, but 2, meaningfully engage with them. One example, in Richmond, we have 2 user-led forums. So these are forums that are disabled service users. They come together. They are the ones who are saying these are the local issues, and then they work with the local authority, bus companies, and other statutory bodies to make recommendations. So a lot of these groups and deaf and disabled people's organisations are already doing work on the ground. So my recommendation is build relationships with DDPOs. That's both from a local authority perspective, so local authorities valuing deaf and disabled people's organisations that are doing a lot of work already in the borough, and valuing the perspectives of local disabled people. I think we see a lot of great engagement with our Transport and Mobility Forum, because there's a particular area of interest in Richmond Borough, to to engage with the local rail companies, but we see less engagement on other issues. So it's rather than kind of cherry picking specific issues, saying actually across the board we want to involve the local organisation that's doing this work in our planning and in any kind of adjustment of policy. So I think that's one recommendation. The other recommendation is I think there's quite an untapped power in the network of DDPOs. So we're all working in different areas, but a lot of us are experiencing the same issues. Our members, our users are experiencing the same issues. So Inclusion London does this you should already do this by bringing us together, but I think there's more work that needs to be done to encourage local DDPOs to come together and attend events like the one that happened yesterday, providing proper remuneration for expertise and skills and professional opinion. So yeah, I think those are two areas.
What I think is interesting is it builds on something you said earlier, which was about planning your day. And I think, Harriet, you touched on this as well. And so if I'm going somewhere, I'll go on Network Rail, I'll see how late the train is, I'll see which tube lines are closed, and then I'll negotiate my way through. But the rest of it I can sort of deal with day to day. I had a quick look, just from my area, I had a look at a supermarket, a cinema, a restaurant, a theatre, to look at what information there was about accessibility. And it's not easy, you know. You scroll down, you find it somewhere at the bottom, you get some generic points, you know, there's wheelchair access, right, to what? And is there any kind of, you know, like they've got the scores on the doors sticker for restaurants that says what, you know, their health score is. Is there any kind of accessibility benchmark, you know, kite mark of good quality that businesses can use so that you can plan your day better? You can say it's not just getting on the train, but is there access to a loo? Can I get in somewhere?
Well, yes and no. It's becoming quite a crowded area, and it's actually one that's been driven by people who have wanted exactly that. And it is one where there's not consistency of information. So what I tend to do is, if I'm going to a place, I will look at a number of websites where people have put up information, having experienced it themselves. Ewan's Guide is perhaps one of the better known ones, and Access Able's another one, and there's an app, the name of which I can't remember, just to do with wheels. And you tend to look at the composite, but actually having something more formal would be immensely helpful. Immensely helpful. I'm always banging on about the importance of preview information to people, and in the planning authority I work in at the moment, I'm trying to get conditions that relate to planning applications that require an access management plan that includes specific mention of preview information, which is exactly what you're describing. It's information about what assistive technology they might have, what the parking looks like, photographs for people who'd find that useful. If you want a good example, St Paul's Cathedral has pretty good information for visitors, and making sure that it's provided in a range of formats as well. So it's not just visual information. So there are options for people too.
Thank you. That's useful. Did you say it was Ewan's Guide? Okay. In terms of best practice, I think, Teri, you touched on this as well, in terms of consultation and about how you are connecting up groups, are there any great examples of best practice we can look at nationally, internationally, that we can go away and research? Hallie, yes.
I just wanted to mention, we were actually involved in a consultation last week at the Tower of London, the Royal Armouries, and I thought it was excellently done. It wasn't co-production, it was strictly a consultation, so bringing disabled people in to share their views on access to the White Tower. But I will say best practice is doing the sort of blank slate approach, you know, bringing people in and saying, come have a look. One, how can we make this consultation more accessible for you, which I think Jane touched on earlier. So that, you know, it needs to be accessible from the start, the actual consultation bit, and then allowing people to come in and say, hey, this is my experience, these are my views, this is the experience, these are the kind of disabling barriers that I see. And then I would say a lot of times disabled people are already utilizing technology or, you know, accessible tech or other things, so they're able to provide solutions when they're not put into a box. When they're put into a box and said, you know, the consultation says, this is what we can do and this is how we're going to do it, it feels kind of pointless, but I would say the Royal Armouries did an excellent job from start to finish, and their access guide is also amazing at the Tower of London. I would definitely say, if you want an example of good practice, it was already really great, but we came in and we were able to make recommendations to make it better. And again, it was just listening and being really open to our perspective.
I just wanted to add that Disability Equality Scotland is a national body. I think it has funding from the Scottish Government, but they support in all the local authorities in Scotland. They help set up access panels. They provide a terms of reference, training, and then it's volunteer-led, and typically those volunteers will be like an access panel and support auditing as well as, you know, new planning applications. So I think that's definitely one worth looking at.
The real challenge seems to be joining everything up. So you have a planning authority that will meet certain standards for the building, but then real life, as Harriet was talking about earlier, as you come out of your house and you go onto the street scene, and then you're going to have to cross a road, then you're going to have to get on transport, then get into a shop, then get back, then get money to pay for things in the shops that you may or may not be able to get into. So it's finding some standards, some agreed sort of, I don't like to use the word baseline principles, but what's acceptable? How should businesses operate? How should planning operate? Is there anything more, he opens the door on this one, that you suggest government should be doing? I mean, around that planning process especially, and the built environment. I know we've touched on it already quite a bit, so Laura.
Yeah, so the government actually launched a consultation on raising accessibility standards in 2020, and last year they actually committed to raise accessibility standards. So M42 is going to be the new default option for building new homes in England, but hasn't been implemented. So we would like to see those changes implemented, because if you delay the process more and more people are going to be living in a suitable accommodation. And also I think in terms of we think that there should be a proportion of wheelchair accessible housing being mandated, because unfortunately it's really post-collatory. Not all local authorities are actually building wheelchair user homes.
Thank you. I've been very tight for time, so I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Assemblymember Fortune, and I know that your questions did get squeezed because there's such rich expertise from the panel today, so we're really grateful that you almost front-loaded a lot of what we wanted to tease out later on. It was been incredibly informative, and to say we had Lisa Fairmaner in the audience. She's just left just this moment, who heads up the London plan and the development, and so everything that's been said today, we hope and we will ensure as much as we can from the committee is integrated into the next iteration of the London plan, and we'll be pursuing that as a committee going forward. And the next part of the panel will have Jules Pipes, the Deputy Mayor, like I mentioned, alongside Lisa, hopefully being able to reflect back some of what you've brought to the table. So please feel free to stay in the public gallery. We'd love to see how whether you feel satisfied with the way that's being responded to, but also, as mentioned by some member Best, do follow up with the committee and just stay in touch. We've been really grateful for your expertise and your knowledge today, so we look forward to continuing working together, and thank you once again. We're going to take a very short adjournment. We're going to come back at sharply 12:15 for the second panel and hopefully get that wrapped up. Until then, thank you again for your time, and we'll see you back at 12:15. Welcome back to those watching the Planning and Regeneration Committee, now moving us into the afternoon and the second panel. As mentioned, this is the second part of our session on accessibility and planning. For the guests who have now joined the meeting, I will repeat what I said at the start. This meeting is being live captioned by palantypists at MyClearText. We ask where possible for speakers to not talk over each other or to speak too quickly, and that the use of jargon is kept to a minimum and any acronyms are explained in order for the meeting to be captioned with as few errors as possible, and also the same advice for committee members. A warm welcome to our second panel of guests. We are joined by Jules Pipe, CV, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, and also Lisa Fairmaner, Head of London Plan and Growth Strategy of the Greater London Authority. Once again, for the purpose of live captioning, can guests introduce themselves when speaking for the first time? Thank you very much to you both. Lisa, I know when you were sitting in the public gallery during the first panel, we, as you saw, had a really rich and excellent panel of experts who gave us so much food for thought that we're hoping to, if not immediately integrate into our questions now to yourself and Jules, we'll certainly be following up obviously in our output in order to make sure we capture accurately what they brought to the table. But we'll start off with the first question, sort of quite broad to you both. Can you outline what the Planning for London programme is, and when and how Londoners can feed into it? And then lastly, if you could let us know when you envisage a review of the London plan to take place, so as accurate as possible with the timeline on that. Thanks, Lisa. And just using your mic, just making sure it's on.
Is that
perfect?
Thank you, everyone. So the Planning for London programme is a set of engagement series to inform the next London plan, whether that be a review or whether that be a whole new London plan. That actual process will take place after the mayoral elections in May next year. So this was an opportunity to speak to a wide range of Londoners through a range of different channels and get those really early, high-level discussion and engagement. So before we start looking at things like specific text or specific policy, there's an opportunity to talk to Londoners about London, about what their vision for the future would be, about impacts on their lives, in a far more strategic and open way. We've built up a huge body of information, and we'll take that forward next year, and we intend to publish that just before we go into pre-election next year, so that some of it's available now, but the rest of it we hope to publish before pre-election next year.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And so just a little bit more on that then. So the Planning for London programme, and you'll be publishing the findings just before pre-election. How does that interact with the wider timetable for the London Plan review?
So after the mayoral election, we'll then be in a position to look at what changes might be appropriate to the London plan quite specifically, and that would need to go through a full set of statutory consultation, including with our borough colleagues. We would also hope for more iterative conversations rather than a kind of one big hit, and we obviously need to go through the examination and public process, and also submission to the Secretary of State and any actions that ensue from that.
Fantastic. And ballpark figure on the timeline of that?
So we think that a review would take 1 to 2 years, certainly well over 1, but at least 2. And then for a whole new plan, we're really talking 3 to 4 years. At a national level, there is a requirement to review your plan every 5 years. So we're already on that 5-year cycle, having adopted the plan in March 21.
Brilliant. And just finally, so significant sort of further contributions to, for instance, the Planning for London programme, if they happened sort of in late January or February, as the committee's hoping to offer a significant submission, would that still be able to be captured even if it's after the publication date?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So you're obviously the committee, so that's really critical to us, and we would take your advice, etc., and thoughts, recommendations, that was the word I was looking for, at any point. So there's obviously no timescales. We probably wouldn't write them up as part of the overall bundle. So what we will be doing is shutting down the engagement programme at the end of December to give us an opportunity to write things up. And we will write them up both separately for each event or each channel that we undertake, but then we'll also try to assimilate that together into a single body of both priorities, but also areas where there's some really obvious divergence, perhaps where people from different communities or different groups think quite differently about each other. So we're trying to both capture points of difference and tension, as well as the purpose of the Planning for London programme has never been to find a single solution. It's to hear people's views and the breadth of those views.
Fantastic. Lisa, I think it's probably a conversation we will take offline, and I don't want to sort of preempt too much sort of wider feedback, but I feel the wrapping up of the review by end of December might be too soon, and I wonder whether there was scope to have a part 2 or reopened post-election. And one of the things, for instance, we've just heard from the panel before is they think that there's a variety of equalities groups that are yet to be engaged with, even though the engagement that's been done so far, I can see, even from outside, has been really vibrant. I'd say, we've had direct feedback this morning from groups about equality groups not necessarily even knowing that the review is taking place, and I can speak further to that by having recently been part of specific stakeholder roundtables regarding the London plan, feeling like they would like a little bit more time to have, I'll bring in a moment, Jules, to have more time to contribute. So, Jules, I'm not sure if you're going to come in on... Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, that's... I think we shouldn't get too hung up on the date of... a cut-off date for them writing reports about the Planning for London programme. This is like the first kick-off of the process, and anything that the committee produces right up to the point of formulating policy in 2025, 6, whenever is absolutely, it's germane to the process. So it's a bit artificial to get too hung up on that. And the second thing is, I just add to what Lisa said, that I think what she said highlights the nature of the formulation of the London plan, is that, and I hope I'm not insulting any planners here, a lot of the time planners aren't formulating policy. The policies are being driven by transport policy specialists, housing specialists, environment specialists, and then today we're discussing accessible design, which will have its own advocates and specialists, which aren't planners. The job of the London plan is to find some sort of balance between the competing priorities, because a lot of those priorities do compete and conflict, and the art of the London plan, I think, is bringing forward a document that is coherent, balances those conflicting policies, and is viable in the sense of being affordable to build out. So I think that was well described.
No, I think that's a really helpful clarification, Jules. I guess it wasn't so much getting hung up on the date of, obviously, the recommendations, whether it's this committee or other groups, will continue to be integrated. But I think for me, December is probably the point where active outreach is maybe coming to an end, whereas sort of the more statutory forms of wider conversations next year for the London plan are more people coming to the table. So I just wanted to keep one eye on the fact that there are probably still a variety of groups that will require active outreach from our side beyond December. Please, Lisa. Just, sorry, with your mic.
Oh, sorry. I think absolutely, and we've always called this phase 1. So this is the opportunity we've had pre-election, and I think even at the event yesterday, I had a conversation at one of the tables saying, in the hours that we have here with you today, we can only just touch the surface, and inclusion, even beyond accessibility, is such a huge issue. And we discussed that we'd want to have drill down sessions focusing on each of the different protected characteristic groups and looking at intersectionality in turn, because we just didn't have enough time yesterday, even in the opportunity that we did create.
No, thank you, and that's really helpful. And I'll probably move us on to the next question now, and I think as I'll do that, I'll sort of maybe integrate one piece of feedback we also had from one of our panellists who was at the session yesterday, sort of saying more broadly that perhaps accessibility and inclusive design is something that should be an agenda item on every agenda for each of the sessions rather than one specific panel, so it's integrated. Assemblymember Berry, you wanted to come in?
Just very quickly on what Lisa said about releasing a lot of data immediately pre-election, is there any scope for releasing things a bit more in stages as you go along, so that, I'm speaking as a former mayoral candidate, I'm not this time, so I haven't got a direct conflict of interest, but it's very useful when the GLA does engage and give information to all the mayoral candidates who might be developing policy. And then conversely, mayoral candidates will be announcing policy. When you're doing data collection, will you be modifying some of that so that potential new mayors might also be, have information that will guide whether they actually implement those policies?
Yeah, the deliberative events are already available, so they're on our website. As soon as we have anything cleared and ready to go, we put it straight up. So we wouldn't wait until that last moment, but that's our own deadline to give us time to be committed to have published every single element. So, for example, the co-design work we did with the London Housing Panel, that was mentioned earlier today, that piece of work, we're in the process of reaching the final stages of writing that up. As soon as it's ready, it will go in the public domain.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
No problem. Okay, just on to my final question before I pass on to the other committee members. I think one thing that the panel was also making quite clear is that in the London Plan, good intentions are really clear, particularly policies in D5, for instance, really do push inclusive design in the right direction, particularly at pre-application stage. What they found is perhaps by the time that development is made, that's when the muscle has weared down. And so sort of how do we sort of bulk up the muscle throughout the development process to ensure that by the time that development is built, it is as inclusive as it was when it was signed off on. So to that end, the question I wanted to ask you both is, how does the current London Plan specifically ensure the principles of inclusive design are implemented in new developments across the city? And are there areas of improvement that you think we could look to for the next London Plan?
Well, in addition to the plan itself, obviously there's the guidance. And I think a lot of the time when you see, it's not often that I'm confronted with anyone demanding more than 500 pages to the London Plan. It's interesting when you do get to that stage where people are asking for more detail, because I think it's the detail, because it wasn't the fact that the policies are wrong, it's the fact that they'd want more detail. And of course there is London Plan guidance. There's been specifically design guidance that's been brought out since the plan, plus there's currently recently published guidance and recently published guidance for consultation and more guidance to come. So I'm thinking of things like the purpose-built student accommodation and co-living accommodation. There are those pieces of guidance touch on accessibility and add to the requirement, add detail to the requirements from those types of dwelling, which speaks to that demand for more detail than there is in the London Plan. Obviously, policy always, the length of time that it takes to produce a London Plan, it's easily foreseeable that demand, expectation is always in advance of policy. Sometimes practice even comes in advance of policy, and we're playing catch up. So that's why it's an iterative process, and what isn't in the plan or in guidance, by the time we come to do the next plan, we would be seeking to meet the expectations, some of which you heard today. Lisa wants to add to that.
That's good. No, I think that's really well said, and I think that was one of the things that I want to please.
Sorry, can I just add one thing though? That in addition, obviously there's, and touching perhaps more specific, more directly on your question about the implementation, that's something we're going to have to look at. I think we're in a position that we in a better position than we were, in as much as we now have the data hub. Before, it was a bit of ad hoc reporting, and sometimes perhaps it was a bit of wishful thinking, some of what was reported to the GLA in the figures, whereas now there is we both get self-certified data from the applicant, and then we get a copy of the Section 106 to be able to ensure that what is in what has been permissioned is in line with expectation. I still think, though, it's quite obvious that there's still potentially a gap there, though. We won't ever have the resources to enforce and check ourselves. But that does leave a question about, well, what process does there have to be, particularly if boroughs are under-resourced and facing difficulties in terms of resourcing their planning departments, and we hear about that all the time. So that is a question that we need to take forward. But that's not so much a plan question, that's a resources of the planning system in the country question.
Okay, no, that's really helpful, Jules. Thank you. And I think Assemblyman Berry is going to come on to talk about data specifically, but I appreciate you also mapping out how we might follow the process more thoroughly from beginning to end. And I think just the final point I'll make before I hand over, which is one of the panellists also did sort of say that as well, which is best practice does develop, and it, in this particular area, is developing quite quickly. So I think there's a lot of examples that were teased out in the first part of the panel that I think we'll be writing up and sending to you, and hoping that we can see, what can be learnt from. Assemblyman Berry.
Thank you very much. So starting with some sort of good news and things that you want to tell us about, can you give us some examples of successful projects that have effectively incorporated inclusive design principles as outlined in the plan? I know the previous panel gave us some examples. If you've got any more, that would be excellent.
Sorry, I haven't come armed with examples. Happy to write, though, with some examples that we think that the team think that they've considered that are good examples.
That would be really great. Thank you.
Is there a particular size, or is it commercial development, housing development?
Well, I'm coming on to that actually, because there were some comments made in the previous panel around inner and outer London, the central activity zone, attractions there being very good. The examples they gave us were of attractions who've engaged really well and provided really good stuff. And then comments were made that potentially, in outer London or smaller venues or smaller businesses, it may not be as good in terms of examples. And they didn't give us any examples of smaller developments.
So they had bigger ones, not smaller.
The ones they gave us were quite large and quite attraction.
Yeah, no, we can definitely come back with one specifically that the Mayor has funded on the Good Growth by Design. We've got about 70 projects. A good chunk of those are small built projects, and inclusivity would have been absolutely at the heart of what they were trying to deliver. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of the National Youth Theatre refurb that we funded in Islington, that ended up having a changing places toilet in it, and it's certainly not a large development, which is what's normally thought of as a development suitable for requiring that. But that program, that project delivered that. So there'll be a whole list of small ones we can point to that the Mayor's funded. I'm sure there are many others across London, and there's some big ones. I mean, I think there are things like the public realm one, like the Strand public realm transformation that's gone on is probably one of them I'd quote. Lisa.
I was just going to note as well, Jules mentioned the London Plan guidance, and the next piece of London Plan guidance, the first one out of the blocks after the mayoral elections, we hope to be the accessible one. So although there's been mention within the housing standards and within other specialist housing, we want to make sure that there's a complete piece and all those gaps are filled in. And the first element of that as part of the Good Growth by Design work is we've been doing a series on through the lens of lived experience, and within that those are qualitative case studies to try and build a picture of the barriers in the built environment, and that engagement has included online workshops, sounding boards and one-to-one interviews. And we've established a strong network of disabled Londoners contributing to this work. 30 plus of them have been engaged as paid workshop participants. So that's the first piece to start to build exactly what you're speaking to, which is what is best practice and what would that look like. And ultimately that piece will go on to help inform what the London Plan guidance says.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving on to housing more specifically, how do you feel that the London Plan is currently ensuring that new housing developments meet the needs of disabled people properly and contribute to independent living?
I mean, I think Lisa's probably best placed to talk to this because it's quite technical about sort of three basic standards and building regs, which obviously lies outside my area, but also building regs also lies outside Lisa's. I know that there's again, this is a kind of quite contested area about what is possible under different bits of legislation and what's responsible for it. I mentioned building regs, but also the national policy planning framework as well does apply constraints about what we can demand from private developers in terms of wheelchair accessible dwellings, for example, or at least adaptable dwellings. I mean, delivery there as a result in private dwellings is woeful, but is quite explainable why that is when you look at the constraints. It doesn't justify it, but when you look at what the constraints are, you can see why it ends up where it does. Clearly, there's a better story to tell in the public sector where there are direct allocations and proper plans can be made, but probably this is probably better positioned. And I know, sorry, before you do, I mean, obviously there's the 10% requirement for adaptable that we have in place. I mean, clearly there's going to be a discussion at some point about whether that's the right figure or not. I think that's going to have to be done I think should it be higher? Yes. Could it be higher? Yes. Could it be higher going through a London plan and being reviewed in terms of viability and what it does to viability and what it does to competing policy requirements? For every 3 or 4 flats that were made adaptable, crucially that means they're going to be significantly bigger. And I'd say for every 3 or 4 adaptable flats, that's probably equivalent to losing 1 unit of affordable housing. So there'll be those kind of trade-offs, coming back to my opening remarks about balancing policy, that would have to be considered. Lisa?
I was going to say there's 2 things we're quite cognizant at the moment. One is that because we have a live data feed now through the Planning Data Hub, the information that's coming back to us demonstrates a real issue, because it's the information that is submitted with the planning applications by the applicant. It's coming through the live data feed, and we're just looking at the numbers going, I'm sorry, what? That in no way reflects what we would have expected to see, with 90% of it meeting the M42 standard and then the other 10% meeting M43. So there's a gap there that we need to unpick, and we're in the process of trying to understand, is that poor data management and record keeping, or is there a real issue and that all boroughs are falling short of delivering the homes that they need to be delivering? So we're working on that. And the second element is the point about wheelchair accessible or adaptable housing, and recognising that it's only within the public sector that we require fully wheelchair accessible, which means there is a gap that's opening up within the market sector for people who want to purchase a home that's suitable to meet their needs. And we are looking at that. That's something for a next London plan, because it is very clearly laid out within the London plan, so no guidance can change that, but I think it's very clear. And the other thing that's we're very aware of at the moment, in part due to the lived experience of somebody within our team, is the categorisation of units and people being able to access them. So although there might be a home that is wheelchair accessible, it's not marketed as such within the market sector, and there are the best way, as I understand, to find the right homes would be just to search for a wet room as opposed to searching for an accessible home, and so that means that people are not able to find the accommodation they're looking to buy. And we know that we do secure some through planning applications, but there's a gap between that and the information that real estate agents have.
Do you, so there's a lot there. There's a couple of follow-up. Am I right that you're sort of effectively saying that government guidance means you can't specify between the 2 different subcategories within the M43 standard, that you can't say, well, we need more things delivered that are wheelchair accessible rather than adaptable?
I think that at the moment the London Plan and Policy D7 is really clear, and it says that you only require the full within the social rented sector where you've got nominations. so you can make sure that the adaptations that have been put into the home are suitable for the user of the home. And we do believe in the team that that's something we want to look again at and seeing whether or not, particularly within the market sector, something more can be done, because the cost of that fit out for somebody purchasing a home can be quite significant, and that's falling between the cracks at the moment.
I'm assuming you watched earlier on when we heard about some ideas from Jane that the requirements for marketing ought to be changed, because disabled people are not going to buy a home off plan on trust that it's going to turn out right for them. They want to see that.
Yeah, I think absolutely that, but also even beyond that, if we secure something through a planning application or a local planning authority, there must be a mechanism for some wording that is used that everybody understands exactly what standard of accommodation you're going to get from that. I think that's quite important for people to be able to find their home they want.
Great, thank you. So going back to the data issue, I've been looking at the dashboard that's provided, that's linked through from the London Plan Monitoring Report for accessible homes that are being delivered. And you're right, the overall numbers that are showing there, and that's just for, I'm just looking at the approvals, not the completions. And I've got an issue because the completions data appears to be the same, and I think there is a note within the Planning Data Hub that says essentially we're taking on trust that what is approved is delivered at the moment, so there's no real follow-through of what isn't delivered in the end, which we absolutely need to know, I think, and I think you're working on that. But at the moment, within that data on just the approvals, there's overall we're looking at 44% of M42 category units, and that should be 100. And this is only data since 2015, since the regulations came in. And 6% of M43 category, when the target's 10%. So that's obviously not high enough. And then an enormous variation between different boroughs. The City of London appears to be delivering 23%, whereas the lowest is, I think, Havering, which says 0.73%. And I think you said before you're not sure that these numbers are real, or they might be to do with different levels of reporting. But that, if we're trying to rely on this data, it would appear that some of the outer London boroughs are particularly low. But that's not a general pattern either. Some of the outer London boroughs are much higher. What can you tell us about whether we can draw any conclusions from this data as it currently stands, and should there be more caveats put in there?
Yeah, I wouldn't draw conclusions at the moment, and just bearing in mind that although we've got M42, we did have its predecessor, which was Lifetime's Home. So these are not new standards. They've been around for a really long time. They're well embedded within the industry. And we think, where you've got those real anomalies of a borough really low, we strongly suspect that's a reporting problem. But like what we do with the housing, for example, we go directly into those local authorities. We say, look, this data just doesn't seem right. What's going on here? And we work with them to clean the data. And that requires one-to-one intervention with all of those boroughs. And we've got, really good colleagues who have good relationships, but we haven't done that work on this particular data yet. And I think we can let you know once we feel a bit more confident about it coming through. But when you have those massive anomalies between one borough and another, we think we're not convinced that there is full compliance, but I don't think we're in position to even judge that at the moment until we iron out these data issues.
Okay, and is there any scope for getting separately reported the two different subcategories within M43? Because that's really what we're all dying to know, essentially.
I would have to get back to you on that. Yeah, I don't know the data tables, but I can get back to you on that.
Okay, great. And then I think we'll have some recommendations around that and making KPIs that are meaningful for disabled people when they're actually buying homes. Do you have any plans also to do anything to investigate existing stock or the quality of refurbishments or retrofits?
Largely outside of the plan.
In terms of the need, though, it would be, in terms of need, the background data, the supporting data for the plan, knowing what's accessible and not in existing stock is surely a
policy-wise,
thing of interest.
That would be a question for housing, and they may well be researching that level of housing need, but it's not something I would be aware of ad hoc day to day now. I can go and ask them.
Okay, so it doesn't form part of the SHMAR data that you need
I'm sure it does, but I don't oversee it. That's a housing issue.
Okay.
I like all the other input from all the other bits of the GLA, the London Plan benefits from that input, but not.
You don't get to specify what they should be.
The SHMAR is something that was an input to the current plan.
I would just note, if there was a standardisation of how we refer to things, that would benefit the existing stock as well. So if you did have somebody who had adapted a home for a wheelchair user, if there was a standard way of saying out there, then when that person didn't need it anymore, then somebody else could take that as a wheelchair accessible home, and that would be across all of both new and old housing stock.
Although local authorities tend to know well which of their properties are wheelchair accessible and have been adapted, or at least they should do.
Yes, exactly. So hopefully we can be collating that at a London level. And then the other thing is, I think you've touched on this before, but you basically said you have no capacity to go and check that there is compliance with the policies at borough level at the sort of completion stage. Is that right? And you've no plans, not even to do any sort of spot checks or sampling?
Well, I wouldn't rule out it never happens on a particular project, but I'm not aware of any, because we've never had that capacity. We aren't an enforcer of boroughs, and we don't have an enforcement function at all for developments. Obviously, boroughs do. Again, they're challenged in terms of resources, so we can't be surprised that it doesn't happen as much as anyone would like. There's probably very little in the plan, such as what we're talking about today, that a borough wouldn't agree with, that's desirable, and therefore there is an incentive that boroughs would enforce it. But as I say, we don't have the resources, and borough resources are challenged. So we absolutely acknowledge the gap there.
Our committee's heard that on a number of different issues, haven't we, in recent years?
I did want to just say, though, that we don't have that enforcement function, and nor can we require local planning authorities to do that kind of enforcement. But I would say that within policy in the current London plan, there's a precedent set around post-occupation checks and energy. And certainly the conversations between yesterday and today, those points, it can just be something really stupid that makes people's lives miserable, just thoughtlessness. And so we're very mindful of that, and we are thinking about that, and we've heard that point.
Excellent. I think there are so many parallels with energy, where the actual implementation, the work done, the quality of the work, a mistake can ruin the entire principle of the thing, and it is a very strong parallel, actually, and where we've got policies that relate to energy, we might consider copying them over a little bit more. We'll have more conversations about this. I'm sorry, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Berry. Over to you, Assembly Member Best.
Could I just come back on that, though? I mean, it's key to remember, though, that different legislation does enable us to do different things in different areas. So, for example, energy, we're able to go far in advance of national policy because there is other legislation that allows us to do so, whereas we're not allowed to be in the vanguard in other areas in the London plan. It is a kind of a bit of a mix and match.
Thank you for the clarification. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks. Morning. Or afternoon, I should say. How is the London plan addressing the challenges faced by disabled individuals in navigating public transport?
I mean, I think those broad kind of points about accessibility, about not just how you move within the site itself, but also recognising people need to be able to access goods and services beyond that often involves public transport. And I think it's also important, so through planning applications, for example, it doesn't just look at within the site itself, it looks at making sure that people can access beyond the site. And I think that's particularly true of the panel that sits within TfL, where they look at those specific issues, whereas if you've got a planning application coming forward, how would those people access the local public transport options? And I'm just going to get the name of it, but there's a specific name, if you'll give me a moment, that they have a independent disability access panel that they get to look at planning applications and things like that when they give the TfL comments on planning applications.
And how about wider transport outside of the actual development of new housing? So, for example, Chapter 10 of the London Plan in regards to transport specifically, as opposed to, that was an example based on developments and new developments.
I mean, I think the overall infrastructure would have to be accessible, and any new bits of kit that would go in. So, for example, if we had a Bakerloo line extension or anything like that, it would have to be fully accessible. In terms of upgrading existing lines, some of the transport infrastructure that's been envisaged is for step-free access, for example, on existing routes.
I think so. A couple of things that we heard this morning to go back to. So, for example, things like toilets, and you've just mentioned the new Bakerloo line. But, for example, I know there was upset when Crossrail was brought in and not every new station had a toilet. Do you think that that's something that could be improved upon in the next iteration of the London Plan?
At the end of the... I mean, the London Plan sets what the standard should be, but not every site is going to be able to deliver that, and that's the same with all policies in the plan, not just on accessibility. All the policies, rather, none of the policies are gateway policies. If a policy cannot be delivered, it doesn't mean that the development cannot go ahead, and there are plenty of Victorian stations that simply the footprint does not allow anything additional. There are plenty of examples of that where the footprint does not allow any additional development to take place. So if it's being refurbed and there is space, clearly it's desirable and it should happen. But if there isn't the footprint to physically make it happen, then it won't. And there's been plenty of examples where stations have been refurbed and those additions can't be made. And also, I mean, unfortunately, there are even cases where there has been private development over access to stations, where I've seen one particular development where it was proposed to have step-free access to some of the platforms, and then that was snatched away on a revision of the proposal, not because it was trying to reduce the cost and what they were paying, but they changed the design of what they were proposing, and it simply just did not lend itself to providing that access. And it wasn't going to be sufficient reason to refuse. It would have been seen as unreasonable to refuse that application based on that change.
Yeah, so I think we all understand that basis of how the London Plan works. But and I know you've said you don't think many people want to see the document go over 500 pages. But I'm just to bring it back to the point, I'm asking more specifically about whether there's an opportunity to more closely link something like toilets into the transport strategy of the local London Plan.
I'm loath to speak on behalf of TfL. Go on then.
I suspect it would be MTS. We're keep those
So
conversations going.
It's more about, so obviously part of the London plan is some of the key figures of that is getting to that 2041 figure of 80% of all journeys by active travel or public transport. And what I think we've heard on this committee this morning, and I've also heard it on the Health Committee as well, is that a barrier to achieving that is the accessibility of public toilets within the network. And so I think there is some opportunity to get that weighting into the London plan, understanding the caveats that doesn't mean that every development can have it. But for example, if we did have that in that document, I think when you look at stations such as Bond Street, would we have possibly ended up with a toilet? And I think the answer is possibly yes. Okay, thanks. And just going on to speak as well about those 2041 targets. Obviously, central London getting from currently 90% up to 95% of active travel and public transport. Outer London from 70 to 80, and then Outer London from 60, I believe, to 75. So quite a jump there. But some of the things we heard this morning was incorporating in that the idea that some people are always going to have trouble with making those transitions, and how that can be addressed more clearly within the London plan. Is that something that we could take away for a further iteration?
Yes, I mean, that's the kind of thing that, you know, monitoring the effectiveness, the feedback that these, not just these recent, the recent Planning for London programme, but also the further engagement over the coming years, all that together will guide what would be in the plan. The short answer is yes, and the longer answer being the how, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And final question related on the transport element of it is around those the limits on parking, specifically disabled parking within new developments, both residential and non-residential. And I don't expect, obviously, a definitive answer because it's in discussion, but is that something that you'll be looking at and assessing in further iterations if those current limits are working?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a particular point of discussion when the current plan was made about the level of provision versus the level of passive provision. And we kind of heard more heavily on passive provision because there was an argument about how much was actually being used and the amount of landscaping it took. So we were clear that we still wanted to demand the same level, that the schemes were capable of achieving the level that we wanted, the 10%, but we did allow more of it to be passive. Was it 5 and 5%, I think, was it? I think. I'm trying to do it from memory, which is bad. But yes, it's definitely something that we would review how successful that policy would be, and we would look to adapt it on the basis of the evidence. Oh, Lisa.
I just wanted to raise a point as well, just around non-standard cycles, and we're making quite a lot of provision and guidance for non-standard cycles that are more suitable for a range of users, both in their storage and also for being able to manoeuvre them around, and making sure public realm is suitable for the use of them. And to that end as well, we specifically targeted Wheels for Wellbeing to come along to our Planning for London events to hear that the kind of lived experience as well, and that was really helpful hearing from them too.
Thank you.
We are going to lose Chorusy in about 5 minutes, so I'm going to move us on, I'm afraid. Is that all right? It's on my best.
So the final question I had was on how the London plan incorporates perspectives and input of disabled individuals and advocacy groups in the planning process to ensure their needs are met. I mean, do you want that?
How it did or how it will?
How it does. Present tense. But I don't know if you... Do you want a...
I think we might have to do some of these following up in writing, to be honest.
Not a list. It would take we have a long list of groups engaged and that will be engaged. So if you prefer it as a list, that's fine.
Yeah.
Please do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to loop back to what we were talking about with units that were accessible for wheelchairs or suitable for wheelchairs. One of the problems that was highlighted is just because a unit is accessible for a wheelchair doesn't mean it is being used as one. So is there anything we can do to try and make sure that these units are being used by the people they're intended for?
I mean, obviously there's a difference to consider between private and public housing. I'd be highly disappointed if a significant amount was being created within the public sector that was not being used for the purpose it was, and I'm not sure whether that is actually being claimed or whether we're just talking about private housing, which clearly there is a huge issue there. Little is being created, and there's no evidence that what is being created ends up being used.
I think there's an argument about both. Sorry, I'm pushing because of time. I think there's an argument about both. I guess there's also units that could be in the private sector that are adapted by local authorities because of people's changing needs, which, when that person moves on, that goes back into the private market. And I think there's probably a charge on the mortgage or something, but there's no real checks on that, are there? And that's probably outside of your...
Yeah, that would be the local authority. I think it goes back to a point that Lisa made about that there's no standard, and that what does it mean to say that there's a private dwelling that has had certain adaptations, what needs it actually meets or doesn't. It would have to be systematised and implemented by boroughs. That level of, because obviously people move around beyond borough borders.
And that's the thing we've come back to, is actually the lack of control, because it's going to be with boroughs, it's going to be with private landlords, there's lack of regulatory control as well, etc. But if we bring it back to what we can do here as the GLA and look at the Mayor's priority in terms of making sure that houses are accessible, and I know there's a plan that's been worked on with that, the new council homes acquisition programme, so that's money that's being taken out of the government grant to buy 10,000 units, there is direct control of that from the Mayor's office. So what provisions have been put in place to those 10,000 home buyback? Because you can set the standards here and you can control it. So what standards and controls are you putting in place for that programme?
Sorry, Deputy Mayor, before you answer, and I will continue your line of questioning, so I'm unfortunate, I'm just going to ask the committee to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion before we lose quoracy.
Great.
Perfect. And then I'll pass back over to you.
Trying to answer as quickly as possible. You'd have to put that to housing, because it just wouldn't come under the plan, because there isn't any planning application involved.
I get that. Sorry for talking over you. I know we're not supposed to do that, but it's time. One of the things that we established this morning is that we can't look at these things in silos. So we can't look at TfL responsibilities like it's not part of the GLA. We can't look at London Plan like it's not part of the GLA. Housing like it's not part of the GLA. So there must have been some sort of team discussion about this 10,000 home programme that's using government grant money to buy these houses back. Can we? Do you know if there's been any?
Not under planning, because there is no
that's
planning
my question.
aspect.
My question is, do you know if there's been any conversation, mindful of the Mayor's priorities about accessibility, do you know if there's been any conversations about these 10,000 units having a certain level of accessibility, wheelchair access, whatever?
I wouldn't be aware if there were or there weren't, because it doesn't come under planning, because there's no application required under planning. And so the policy, any of those policies would sit with housing or elsewhere within the GLA.
I understand that completely, but you've not been involved in any discussions about this?
No.
We did participate in having conversations around the Affordable Homes Programme more generally, but I'd have to check with colleagues about the buybacks separately, just because we've got a few...
Because the key point here is everything else that we've highlighted as a challenge, actually with this buyback programme, you have control, the Mayor's office has control.
Well, as I say, it doesn't come. It can't come under planning. And similarly,
the Mayor's office has control.
I know this morning there was reference about private sector housing and having when people make do something to their house. I'm trying to stick to saying extensions, but making changes to their homes and requiring adaptations to be made for accessibility. But an awful lot of those changes don't require planning permission, and therefore it doesn't even involve the local authority, let alone the London plan. It simply isn't a planning issue in the sense of what we could make rules about or encourage. But it's an absolutely valid question, but it's one for the requirements for housing and the requirements it can make of what it's doing.
So just because of time, is that something we can follow up on just to see what the standards are around the Mayor's commitment to accessibility with these 10,000 units that's being essentially, the money from this office is being distributed to it, so there is direct control?
Yeah, we can ask
happy
housing.
to have that, sent as a follow-up. Did you want to ask any more? Assemblyman Best, did you want to come back to your question briefly? I think it has been incorporated in 20.
No, I think that, but it would be good if you wanted to maybe give that list.
That would be grand. The final question Senator Baker passed over to me was answered at the beginning, which was about the publication of the Planning for London programme, which will happen in December. I just wanted to ask briefly, can the sessions be held online, any of the last engagement sessions? Because we have had some feedback that the lack of hybrid means it's been less accessible for certain Londoners.
Yeah, two things. Some of the events are online, and we did have to balance that. We have made provision, any accessibility needs people have. We've had a BSL interpreter here and things like that, so we've done our best. We have two participants who are not able to come in City Hall, and we'll run bespoke sessions with them promptly online and just one-to-one with colleagues from around planning so that we can capture their views, and probably together, so they've got someone to bounce their ideas off. Also, every single thing that goes on out there is duplicated online, so anyone, for whatever reason, who can't come in can add their thoughts online.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lisa. Right, that was extensive, and we have run over slightly on time, so I'm grateful for the patience of the committee. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to note its work programme?
I'm really tempted now that we've got the numbers in our favour to do something your group did to me the other day, but I'll be politer and remember that kindness.
Oh, I will remember that kindness, send me my best, don't you worry. I'm sure you'll remind me even if I did forget. The next meeting of the Planning Regeneration Committee will take place on the 30th of January 2024 at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no other urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.